10-year-old girl runs barefoot through a freezing rainstorm with blood on her sleeve and a dead man's secret in her backpack. Behind her, headlights crawl through the dark like the eyes of something hunting. She has nowhere to go, no one to call. The cops can't help her, because some of them are the reason she's running. The only door still open belongs to a roadside diner where 7 scarred military bikers sit drinking black coffee at 2 in the morning. Men the world already forgot. Men who weren't looking for trouble. But trouble just found them. And what happens next will change every single one of their lives, or end them. If you're ready for a story about broken men, impossible choices, and a little girl who trusted outlaws more than the law, stay until the very end. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's ride. The rain that fell on Blackwater Ridge in the winter of that year didn't fall like normal rain. It came sideways, driven by a wind that howled down from the mountains like something wounded and angry, slashing across neon signs and cracked asphalt until the whole town looked like it was bleeding light. Gutters overflowed. Storm drains choked. The few people still outside walked hunched and fast, collars up, eyes down, like they already knew this wasn't a town that rewarded anyone for paying attention. Blackwater Ridge sat in the crease between 2 forgotten mountain ranges in the rural stretch of eastern Pennsylvania, a place where coal money died 50 years ago, and nothing had come along to replace it except methamphetamine, government contracts, and silence. The main street had a pawn shop, 2 churches nobody attended anymore, a bail bonds office, and a diner called Ricky's that stayed open 24 hours, mostly because the owner, Ricky Salinas, was 71 years old and afraid that if he fell asleep, he wouldn't wake up again. It was inside Ricky's diner, at 2:14 in the morning on a Thursday in January, that the story began. 7 motorcycles sat parked in a crooked line outside beneath the buzzing remains of a Budweiser sign that had been half dead since 2019. Harley Davidsons, mostly. Road Kings. A couple of Dynas. Their chrome was dulled by rain, their leather saddlebags dark and swollen with water. The machines looked tired. They looked like they'd been somewhere hard and had no intention of explaining where. Inside the diner, 7 men sat spread across 2 booths and 1 counter stool, and not a single one of them was talking. They wore leather cuts, black vests stitched with a patch on the back, showing a winged skull gripping a rifle over crossed pistons, the words Iron Saints MC curving above and below in silver thread gone gray with age. Their hands were rough. Their knuckles were scarred. Their eyes carried the kind of distance that only comes from seeing things no civilian vocabulary could hold. These were not criminals. The Iron Saints had no drug pipeline, no protection racket, no territory war. What they had was a garage, a charter built on loyalty, and a collection of men who had come home from wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and places the government never officially admitted to, only to find that home didn't exist anymore. Their wives had left. Their kids had grown up without them. The VA had put them on waiting lists that never ended, so they found each other. They built something small and real in a world that had offered them nothing, and they held on to it with engine grease and silence, and the unspoken agreement that nobody in the club would ever be left behind again. The man sitting alone at the far end of the counter was Coulter Vane. He was 44 years old, 6'2", with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains outside, and then cracked in several places. His dark hair was cut short, military short, and his beard was trimmed close in a way that suggested discipline rather than style. A scar ran from his left temple to the hinge of his jaw, shrapnel from Fallujah, 2004. His hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he hadn't moved to warm it. He hadn't moved at all. Coulter Vane had been the Iron Saints road captain for 6 years, which meant he planned the routes, managed the logistics, and kept the wheels turning. But anyone in the club would tell you the same thing if you asked. Coulter wasn't a leader because he wanted to be. He was a leader because he was the last man to flinch, the last man to speak, and the first man to step forward when stepping forward meant bleeding. He also hadn't slept more than 4 hours in a row in almost 3 years. Not since the dream started. The one where his daughter Emma's voice called to him from the end of a long hallway he could never reach the end of. Emma had died at age 7, leukemia. Coulter had been on his 3rd deployment when it happened. He made it home 11 hours after they buried her. His wife left him 4 months later. She didn't leave because she hated him. She left because every time she looked at him, She saw the empty chair at the kitchen table, and neither of them could survive that silence together. So Coulter stopped talking about it. He stopped talking about most things. The other saints understood. That was the deal. You didn't push, you didn't pry. You just showed up, rode beside a man, and let the highway do the healing that words never could. At the booth closest to the door sat Decker Deck Rawlings, the Saint's sergeant-at-arms, a massive black man with a shaved head and forearms like bridge cables who had lost his left leg below the knee to an IED in Kandahar, and now walked on a titanium prosthetic that clicked faintly against the floor when he moved. Deck had a voice like gravel poured into a drum, and a laugh that could shake windows, but tonight he wasn't laughing. He was staring at the rain hitting the glass like it owed him something. Across from Deck sat the youngest member, a 26-year-old named Jamie Perez, Ghost, to the club. A combat medic who had come home from Syria with steady hands, an encyclopedic knowledge of trauma surgery, and a methamphetamine habit that had nearly killed him twice before the Saints pulled him off the street behind a bus station in Scranton and told him he had one chance. Ghost had been clean for 14 months. He still flinched at loud noises. He still slept with the lights on. But he was alive, and in the Iron Saints, alive was enough. Ricky Salinas stood behind the counter wiping the same glass he'd been wiping for 10 minutes, watching his regulars the way a man watches a fire. Not because it's beautiful, but because he knows what it can do. He knew the Saints weren't dangerous to him. They paid their tabs. They never raised their voices inside his walls. But he also knew that whatever weight these men carried, it was the kind that could shift without warning. Nobody spoke. The rain hammered. The coffee went cold. The clock on the wall behind the register ticked past 2:15, then 2:16, then 2:17. And then the front door of the diner slammed open so hard the little brass bell above the frame cracked against the wall and fell to the floor. A girl stood in the doorway. She was small, terrifyingly small, maybe 10 years old, with tangled brown hair plastered to her face by rain and something darker. Her feet were bare. Her jeans were torn at both knees. She wore a thin pink hoodie soaked through to the skin, and on her left sleeve there was blood. Not a lot, but enough. She was clutching a child's backpack to her chest with both arms like it was the only thing in the world keeping her from falling apart. Behind her, through the open door, snow and rain swirled together in a violent curtain, and beyond that, out in the parking lot, a pair of headlights sat idling, not moving, just watching. Every biker in the diner went still. Deck's hand stopped halfway to his coffee. Ghost straightened in his seat, his medic's eyes already scanning the blood on the girl's sleeve, calculating. Two other Saints, Boone and Harlan, both Afghan vets, both men who had once cleared rooms full of armed combatants, turned in their booth with an alertness that hadn't dulled since deployment. Ricky put down the glass. The girl's eyes swept the room in one frantic pass, the leather cuts, the scars, the hard faces, the silence. And for a moment she looked like she might bolt, like the fear inside her was fighting between the danger in front of her and the danger behind her, and neither direction promised anything safe. Then she looked at Coulter Vane. Something happened. Later, none of them would be able to explain it clearly. Maybe it was the way Coulter didn't move, the way he didn't flinch or stand or reach for anything, the way his eyes, gray and steady and deeply, impossibly tired, simply looked at her the way still water looks at the sky, reflecting everything, demanding nothing. The girl took 3 stumbling steps forward, leaving wet footprints on the linoleum, and stopped 5 feet from the counter. "I think my stepdad killed somebody," she whispered. The sentence landed in the diner like a stone dropped into a frozen lake. Nobody breathed. Outside, the headlights in the parking lot shifted. The vehicle moved, slowly, deliberately, rolling forward about 10 feet, then stopping again. Whoever was inside was not in a hurry. They were waiting. They were watching. Coulter's gaze moved from the girl to the headlights, then back to the girl. His jaw tightened, 1 degree. That was all. But Deck saw it, and Ghost saw it, and Boone saw it, and every single one of them understood what that 1 degree shift meant, because they had seen it before. In Fallujah, in Helmand, in the back alleys of places the news never covered. It meant Coulter Vane had just moved from still to ready. "Deck," Coulter said quietly. Not a question, not a command, just a name. But Deck was already standing, already moving toward the door, his prosthetic clicking softly, his massive frame filling the doorway as he pulled it shut and turned the lock. "Ghost," Coulter said next, and the young medic was already sliding out of the booth, already pulling a small first aid pouch from the inside pocket of his cut, already kneeling beside the girl with hands that were steady and gentle and completely calm. "Hey," Ghost said softly, showing his empty palms. "I'm not going to touch you unless you say it's okay, but I need to look at your arm. Can I do that?" The girl stared at him. Her lips trembled. Rain dripped from her hair onto the floor. Then she nodded. One small, broken nod. Ghost carefully rolled up her sleeve. The cut was shallow, a defensive wound probably from a piece of glass or the edge of something metal. Not life-threatening. But Ghost's eyes tightened when he saw the bruises beneath the blood. Old bruises. Yellow-green. The kind that come in layers, one on top of another, week after week after week. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look he gave Coulter over the girl's head said everything. This child had been hurting for a long time, and whatever she had just run from was only the latest chapter. Coulter turned his coffee mug slowly on the counter, one full rotation. Then he spoke to the girl for the first time. "What's your name?" "Ivy," she said. "Ivy Mercer." The name hit the room like a slap. Mercer. Wade Mercer. Every man in that diner knew the name. Wade Mercer was Blackwater Ridge's golden son, the city contractor who had won a $100 million federal redevelopment deal to rebuild the old industrial waterfront. His face was on billboards. His handshake was in photographs with senators. He donated to the Youth Baseball League, sponsored the volunteer fire department, and had recently been profiled in the state newspaper as the man rebuilding Blackwater Ridge. And now his stepdaughter was standing barefoot and bleeding in a roadside diner at 2 a.m, telling a room full of scarred bikers that he had killed someone. Coulter's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a door opening into a room he had kept locked for a very long time. "Who did he kill, Ivy?" The girl's fingers tightened on the backpack. "A woman. She came to the house. They were arguing in the office. I heard a sound, like something heavy falling, and then it got quiet. And then he came out, and his hands were... She stopped. Her whole body shook. Ghost put a hand on her shoulder, gentle, anchoring. "You're safe," he said. "Right here, right now. You're safe." Ivy swallowed hard. "I took this." She unzipped the backpack with trembling fingers and pulled out a small black flash drive. "It was in his desk. He keeps it locked. But I know where the key is. I've always known." She held it out like a grenade she couldn't hold anymore. Coulter stared at the flash drive. He didn't take it. Not yet. "Why did you come here?" he asked. "Why not the police?" Ivy looked at him, and in that moment, the expression on her face was older than any 10-year-old should ever look. Older and sadder and more knowing. "Because the police come to our house," she said. "They come for dinner. They laugh with him. They call him Sir. I heard one of them on the phone last week. He said if anyone talked, they'd make it go away." She paused. "I didn't know where else to go. I just saw the motorcycles and I just ran." Silence. Long, brutal silence. Outside, the headlights in the parking lot were gone. But that didn't mean anything. In Coulter's experience, the most dangerous things in the world were the ones that stopped being visible. Ricky Salinas spoke from behind the counter, his voice low and careful. "Coulter, I've known you 8 years. Whatever this is, it's not something you boys need to carry. Call the state police. Let the system handle it." Coulter looked at Ricky. Then he looked at Ivy. Then he looked at the flash drive still trembling in her outstretched hand. The system. The system had sent him to war 3 times and given him a folded flag and a prescription for pills that made him feel like he was drowning in cotton. The system had put Ghost on a 6-month waiting list for addiction treatment while he was sleeping behind a dumpster. The system had denied Deck's disability claim twice before a lawyer from a veterans nonprofit fought for 11 months to get it approved. The system. "Ricky," Coulter said quietly, "the system is what she's running from." He reached out and took the flash drive from Ivy's hand. It was warm from her grip, small enough to disappear inside his fist. Deck had moved back to the window and was scanning the parking lot through a gap in the blinds. "Vehicle's gone," he said. "But I got the plate. Dark SUV. Looked like a Tahoe. Government plates." Government plates. The words settled into the room like a weight. Boone, a lean man with sun-ruined skin and a voice like dry wood, stood up from his booth and cracked his neck. So we're looking at a city contractor with federal money, cops in his pocket, and government vehicles hunting a 10-year-old in the middle of the night. He exhaled slowly through his nose. Coulter, brother, I love you. But this is the kind of thing that gets clubs buried. I know, Coulter said. You know. And you're still holding that drive. I am. Boone looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Ivy, who was sitting on the counter stool now, ghost wrapping a clean bandage around her arm while she stared at the floor with eyes that were far too still for a child. All right, Boone said. All right. Nobody else argued. That was how the Iron Saints operated. You spoke your piece, you heard the response, and then you either walked or you stayed. Every man in that diner stayed. They moved fast after that. Coulter gave quiet orders. Not commands exactly, but directions offered in a voice so low and steady that following them felt less like obedience and more like gravity. Ghost took Ivy to the back of the diner near the kitchen, wrapped her in a dry flannel shirt that Ricky pulled from a box of lost and found clothes, and gave her a cup of hot chocolate that she held with both hands like a lantern in the dark. Two of the Saints, Harlan and a quiet tattooed man named Reno, went outside to run a perimeter check of the block. Dex stayed at the window. Boone started making calls on a prepaid phone. Coulter sat alone at the counter and turned the flash drive over in his fingers. He knew what this was. He knew the weight of it. He had held things like this before. Intelligence, evidence, the small objects that decide whether people live or die. In Fallujah, he had once carried a hard drive pulled from an insurgent compound for 16 miles through hostile territory because the data on it could save an entire platoon. He had made it, barely. The scar on his face was the price. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone with clear enemies and rules of engagement and a chain of command to report to. This was a small town in rural Pennsylvania where the enemy wore suits and shook hands and the rules were whatever he decided they were. This was a little girl who had no one. And Coulter Vane, a man who had failed to save his own daughter, was now holding the one thing that might save her. The irony tasted like black coffee and ashes. His phone buzzed. A text from a blocked number. 4 words. Return what's ours. He stared at the screen, then he turned the phone off and slid it into his pocket. Ricky walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. Coulter, I mean this as a friend. Men like Mercer don't lose. They don't get caught. They get richer and the people who cross them get quiet. You understand what I'm saying? I understand. Then why? Coulter looked toward the back of the diner where Ivy sat beneath a fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered, her small frame swallowed by the oversized flannel, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. She hadn't cried. Not once. And somehow, that was worse than if she had. Because nobody came for her, Ricky. She walked into a room full of strangers with blood on her arm and bare feet, and she asked for help. And if we don't answer that, if men like us don't answer that, then what the hell were we even surviving for? Ricky said nothing. He folded the towel. He set it on the counter, and then he walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and flipped the neon open sign to dark. I'll make more coffee, he said. The Saints left Ricky's diner at 3:40 a.m. in a staggered formation, 3 bikes ahead, 2 behind, Coulter in the center with Ivy riding behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face buried against the back of his leather cut. The rain had turned to snow, thick and fast, and the roads were already slick with black ice. The engines rumbled low as they cut through the empty streets of Blackwater Ridge, passing dark storefronts and dead traffic lights, and a town that slept with its eyes closed while a monster sat in its nicest house and made phone calls. They rode for 20 minutes before turning off the highway onto a gravel road that hadn't been maintained since the last steel mill closed in 1997. The road wound through bare trees and frozen mud before ending at a chain-link fence wrapped in dead ivy. Behind the fence stood the ruins of Leland Steelworks, a massive complex of brick and rusted metal that looked like a cathedral built by people who worshipped machines instead of anything else. The Saints had claimed the underground garage beneath the main building 4 years ago, reinforcing it with concrete barriers, welding steel doors over the entrances, and running power from a generator they kept fed with diesel. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs. The garage smelled the way it always did. Motor oil, welding flux, cold concrete, burnt coffee from the pot that Boone kept running 24 hours a day. And beneath all of it, the deep iron scent of the old mill, the ghost of 100 years of molten steel. Harley sat in rows along the far wall, chrome catching the dim overhead lights. Workbenches were cluttered with tools, parts, half-empty bottles of bourbon. A radio in the corner played low static between stations. The walls were covered in old photographs, military patches, and a hand-painted mural of the Iron Saint's crest that Reno had spent 3 months working on. Ivy stood in the center of the garage, still wearing the oversized flannel, still clutching her backpack, and turned in a slow circle. Her eyes moved across the motorcycles, the tools, the scarred faces of the men around her, and for the first time since she had stumbled into Ricky's diner, something in her expression shifted. Not relaxation. That would come later, if it came at all. Something closer to recognition, as if she understood that this place, ugly and cold and buried beneath a dead factory, was somehow more honest than anything she had known. "You can sleep in the back room," Coulter told her. "There's a cot. Clean blankets. Ghost will be right outside the door." Ivy looked up at him. "Are you going to call the police?" "No." "Are you going to send me back?" Coulter knelt so his eyes were level with hers. His knees cracked. His back ached. I was 44 years old and felt like 70, and the look in this child's eyes was the most painful thing he had faced since the day he stood at his daughter's grave with dirt on his dress shoes, and nothing left inside him but a howl he never let out. "Nobody is sending you anywhere," he said. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. You're here. You're with us. And that's how it stays until we figure this out." Ivy studied his face the way children study the faces of adults when they're deciding whether a promise means anything. It was a long look, measured, exhausted, ancient. Then she nodded, turned, and walked to the back room without another word. Ghost watched her go. "She hasn't cried," he said quietly. "No," Coulter said. "Kids cry, Coulter. When they're scared, when they're hurt, when the world breaks around them, they cry. She hasn't. Not once." Coulter stared at the closed door of the back room. "That means this wasn't the first time her world broke," he said. The club gathered around the main workbench at 4:15 a.m., while the generator hummed and snow piled against the steel doors outside. Coulter placed the flash drive on the bench between a socket wrench and an empty whiskey glass, and everyone stared at it like it was an unexploded round. Deck spoke first. "We need to know what's on that drive before we make a single move." "Agreed," Coulter said. "I know somebody," Ghost said. "Old Army buddy. Works cybersecurity now, freelance, paranoid as hell, but solid. He could crack whatever's on there without leaving fingerprints." "How fast?" "If I call him tonight, maybe 24 hours. Coulter nodded. "Do it." Boone leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. "And in the meantime, Mercer knows the girl ran. He knows she took something. His people were already at the diner. How long before they trace the bikes?" "They won't trace the bikes," Harlan said from his seat on an overturned crate. "No plates. Reno pulled them before we left Ricky's. They don't need plates. They need one traffic camera, one witness, one gas station receipt. Mercer's got money and cops. That's better than plates." The truth of it hung in the air, like cigarette smoke. Coulter looked around the room. These were his brothers. Men who had bled beside him, men who had held each other through nightmares and withdrawal and divorce papers, and the slow erosion of everything they once believed about the country they had fought for. He had no right to drag them into this. He knew that. They knew that. But they were still here. "Here's what we know," Coulter said. "A 10-year-old girl says Wade Mercer killed someone. She has evidence. Local law enforcement is compromised. If we hand her over, she disappears. If we call state police, Mercer's lawyers bury it before sunrise. If we go public, nobody believes a motorcycle club over a man who builds hospitals." He paused. "And if we do nothing, that girl goes back into that house, and whatever's been happening to her continues until it kills her." Nobody spoke. "So we hold," Coulter said. "We hold her, we protect her, we find out what's on the drive, and then we figure out who in this state still has a conscience and we put it in their hands." Deck nodded slowly. Boone exhaled. Ghost cracked his knuckles, a nervous habit left over from the field. And then Reno, who almost never spoke, who communicated mostly through nods and the art he painted on the walls in silence, looked up and said 5 words that settled the room like a verdict. She came to us. We stay. It was decided. By 5:11 a.m., the Saints had set a watch rotation, secured the perimeter, and Ghost had made his call. Coulter walked to the steel doors of the garage and stepped outside into the snow. The air was brutal, 15 degrees, maybe less, and the wind cut through his jacket like it was nothing. He lit a cigarette. The cherry glowed orange in the dark. He stood there for a long time, smoking, watching the snow fall on the ruins of Leland Steelworks, listening to the wind and the distant sound of a freight train somewhere on the ridge. The world was silent and white and empty. His phone, the prepaid he kept for club business, buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Another block number. This time, not a text. A photograph. The image showed the front of Ricky's diner taken from across the street. Time-stamped 2:47 a.m. In the photo, through the rain-streaked glass, you could see the blurred shapes of men in leather and one small figure sitting on a counter stool. Beneath the photo, a single line of text. We know where she went. We know who you are. You have 12 hours. Coulter stared at the screen. The cigarette burned down to his fingers. He didn't feel it. 12 hours. Somewhere inside the garage behind him, a 10-year-old girl who hadn't cried was sleeping on a military cot in an underground room that smelled like engine oil and cold steel, trusting strangers she had known for less than 2 hours with the only life she had. And somewhere across town, in a house with clean windows, and a manicured lawn and a front door that cost more than most people's cars, Wade Mercer was counting the hours. Coulter crushed the cigarette under his boot. Then the garage's motion sensor tripped, the one they'd mounted on the east fence, the one that faced the old access road nobody was supposed to know about. And in the snow-covered distance, moving slow through the tree line with their headlights off, came 3 black SUVs. The 3 black SUVs came through the tree line like predators, slow, deliberate, headlights killed, nothing but the faint crunch of tires on frozen gravel and the low growl of engines running cold. Coulter watched them from the shadow of the steel door, with his cigarette dead between his fingers and his breath turning white in the dark. 15 degrees. Maybe 12. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin. It reaches in through your ribs and wraps around whatever's left inside. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He counted. 3 vehicles. Probably 4 men each. 12 bodies against 7, and one of his 7 was a 26-year-old kid 14 months clean who still flinched at car backfires. The SUVs stopped at the fence line, 200 yards out, their engines idled. Nobody got out. They were measuring. Coulter turned and stepped back inside the garage, pulling the steel door shut behind him. The clang echoed through the concrete space like a gunshot. Deck was already on his feet, prosthetic clicking against the floor, a Mossberg 12 gauge in his hands that he'd pulled from the weapons locker bolted beneath the main workbench. Boone was behind him with a Colt 45 on his hip and a look on his face that said he'd already done the same math Coulter had. East fence, Coulter said quietly. 3 Tahoes. Lights off. Sitting. How many? Enough. Harlan moved to the security monitor. A grainy black and white feed from 4 cameras they'd mounted around the perimeter 2 years ago after a meth crew tried to claim the building. The screens showed snow, static, and the blurred shapes of 3 vehicles sitting motionless in the dark, like stones in a river. They're not moving, Harlan said. They don't need to, Coulter said. They're sending a message. They want us to know they found us. They want us to feel the walls closing. Deck racked the Mossberg. The sound was sharp and final in the cold garage. Then let's send one back. No. Coulter's voice was low, but it filled the room. That's what they want. They want us to come out swinging so they can paint us as the threat. Armed bikers assault law enforcement officers serving a warrant. That's how the headline reads. And then Ivy disappears into the system, and Wade Mercer goes on television looking like a grieving father. Dex stared at him. The muscles in his jaw worked like machinery. So we just sit here? We move. Fast. There's a second way out. The old loading tunnel on the west side. Runs under the rail yard and comes out at the switching station half a mile from Route 9. Reno, you and Harlan take Ivy through the tunnel on foot. Ghost goes with you. You get to the switching station, and you wait. And you? Boone asked. Coulter looked at the monitor. The SUVs still hadn't moved. Deck, Boone, and I stay. We make noise. We make them think everyone's still inside. We buy you 30 minutes. Coulter? 30 minutes, Boone. That's all I need. Boone's mouth tightened into a line that could have been drawn with a razor. He wanted to argue. Every instinct in his body wanted to argue. But he had served with Coulter Vane for 6 years, and in those 6 years he had learned one immovable truth. When Coulter spoke in that voice, that low, flat, steady voice that sounded like concrete setting, the decision was already made. You could fight it, or you could follow it, but you couldn't change it. 30 minutes, Boone repeated. And then what? Then we ride out the front, and we don't look back. The next 7 minutes were controlled chaos. Ghost woke Ivy from the cot in the back room. She came awake instantly, no confusion, no disorientation, just wide eyes and clenched fists, the reflexes of a child who had learned to sleep like a hunted animal. Ghost knelt in front of her and spoke in that medic's voice, calm and measured, the same voice he'd used on bleeding soldiers in the field. Ivy, we need to move, right now. I need you to put your shoes on. Here, take Reno's boots, we'll stuff the toes, and I need you to stay close to me. Can you do that? Ivy looked at him. Then she looked past him, toward the garage where she could hear boots moving fast, and the metallic sounds of men preparing for something ugly. They found us, she said. Not a question. Ghost hesitated. Then he nodded. Ivy pulled the boots on. They were 4 sizes too big. She didn't complain. She grabbed her backpack, the one with the flash drive, and slung it over both shoulders and stood up straight, and in that moment she looked less like a 10-year-old and more like a soldier preparing for a movement she'd been trained for her entire short, brutal life. Ghost felt something crack in his chest, a fracture in the wall he'd built around the part of himself that still felt things too deeply. He pushed it down. Later. Feel it later. Right now. Move. Reno led them through the back of the garage to a rusted maintenance door that opened onto a stairwell, descending into absolute darkness. The loading tunnel was a relic of the steel mill's original infrastructure, a concrete corridor 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall that had once carried rail carts loaded with raw iron from the switching yard to the foundry floor. It hadn't been used in decades. The air inside was cold and dead and smelled like wet stone and something chemical that Reno didn't want to identify. Reno went first with a flashlight. Ivy walked behind him. Ghost brought up the rear. Harlan stayed at the top of the stairs with his .45 drawn, watching the garage, waiting for the signal. In the main garage, Coulter fired up 2 of the Harleys and let them idle, their engines filling the concrete space with thunder. From outside, through the walls, it would sound like the club was mobilizing. Deck positioned himself near the east-facing camera monitor. Boone moved to the south door with a rifle. On the monitor, the first SUV's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark tactical jacket and a badge on a lanyard around his neck. He walked toward the fence with his hands visible and his posture carefully relaxed, the way law enforcement approaches when they want to project authority without triggering a firefight. "Iron Saints," the man called out, his voice carrying through the snow. "This is Detective Gareth Nolan, Blackwater Ridge Police Department. We have reason to believe a missing minor is inside your facility. We're requesting voluntary compliance. Open the gate." Coulter watched the monitor. Gareth Nolan. He knew the name. Deck knew it too. His jaw went tight and his grip on the Mossberg shifted. "Nolan," Deck said, and the word came out like something he'd chewed and spit. "He was at the Mercer fundraiser last fall, the one at the country club. I saw the pictures in the paper, standing right next to Wade, big smile, glass of champagne. I remember. So that's who they sent. A cop who drinks champagne with the man we're protecting a child from." Coulter said nothing. He watched Nolan on the monitor, standing patiently at the fence in the falling snow, badge glinting in the faint light from somewhere, and he thought about all the times in his life he had been told to trust the system, trust the chain of command, trust the process, trust the people in charge. And every single time the system had been a door that closed in his face. "Coulter," Deck said, "what do we do?" "We stall." Coulter walked to the east door, opened it 6 inches, and spoke through the gap. His voice carried across the frozen yard, flat and emotionless. "Detective, you got a warrant?" Nolan's smile was visible even from this distance, professional, practiced, the smile of a man who had learned to wear his face like a uniform. Mr. Vane, I don't need a warrant when a child's safety is at stake. You know that. I know a lot of things. I know you're standing on private property at 4 in the morning with 12 men and no paperwork. I know you showed up with tactical vehicles to collect a 10-year-old girl. And I know that if she was really just a missing kid, you'd have sent one squad car and a social worker, not a strike team. The smile didn't waver, but something behind Nolan's eyes recalculated. Mr. Vane, I'm trying to keep this civil. Then go get a warrant, come back in the morning, bring a judge. Bring cameras, we'll have a conversation. The girl is warm, fed, and sleeping, which is more than she was when she showed up bleeding in a diner 3 hours ago. You want to talk about child safety, detective? Let's talk about the bruises on her arms, the old ones, the ones that somebody's been putting there for months. Silence from the other side of the fence. The snow fell heavier now, thick curtains of white between the two men, and the wind howled through the ruins of Leland Steel Works like something trapped and furious. Nolan took a step back, just one. But it was enough. He turned and walked back to the SUVs, and the vehicles sat for another 4 minutes. Coulter counted every second. Before their engines revved and they reversed slowly, back through the tree line and into the dark. They were gone. But Coulter knew they would be back, and next time they would bring paper and guns, and a story that would make the Iron Saints look like exactly what the world already assumed they were: dangerous, lawless, unfit to be anywhere near a child. He closed the steel door. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Deck was watching him. You just bought us maybe 8 hours, Deck said. Maybe less. I know. And you put your name out there. Nolan knows you. He knows your face, your voice, your cut. Mercer will have a file on you by morning. I know. Deck set the Mossberg down on the workbench and rubbed his face with both hands. When he looked up, his eyes were heavy. Coulter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Ask. Is this about the girl, or is this about Emma? The name hit Coulter in the sternum, not because he wasn't expecting it. He was always expecting it, the way you always expect a wound that never fully closes to bleed again. But because Deck had never said it out loud before. In 6 years of brotherhood, 6 years of riding and bleeding and sitting in silence through the worst nights either of them had ever known, Deck had never once spoken Coulter's dead daughter's name. Coulter stared at his brother. The garage was quiet. The 2 idling Harleys had been cut. The only sound was the generator humming and the wind outside and the slow drip of melting snow from somewhere in the ceiling. Both, Coulter said. That's what I thought. Does it change anything? Deck looked at the closed door of the back room where Ivy had slept. Then he looked at the steel door that led outside, toward the fence line, toward the town, toward everything that was coming for them. No, Deck said. It doesn't change anything, but it means I need to watch you. Because a man fighting for a ghost and a man fighting for a living child make different decisions, and I need to know which one is standing next to me when the shooting starts. Coulter held his gaze. You'll know. I'd better. They stood there in the cold garage, 2 broken veterans who had survived wars they shouldn't have, staring at each other across a workbench covered in tools and empty bottles, and neither of them looked away. By 6:00 a.m. the snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped to single digits, and the sky over Blackwater Ridge was the color of old concrete. Reno, Ghost, and Ivy had reached the switching station through the tunnel and were waiting in an abandoned signal operator's shack that still had 3 walls standing and a roof that mostly held. Ghost texted confirmation from a burner phone. 3 words. Package safe. Holding. Coulter, Deck, and Boone rode out the front gate 40 minutes after Nolan's SUVs disappeared, taking a back route along frozen logging roads that hadn't seen a plow in years. The bikes protested every mile. Ice on the throttle cables, frozen brake lines, the constant threat of a slide on black ice that would put a man and 1,200 pounds of motorcycle into a ditch. But they made it. They always made it. That was the deal. They reunited at the switching station as dawn crept gray and thin over the ridgeline. Ivy was sitting on a wooden crate in the corner of the shack, drawing in a small notebook with a pencil stub she'd found in her backpack. She was drawing a motorcycle. The detail was remarkable. She'd captured the curve of the fenders, the angle of the handlebars, the texture of the exhaust pipes. And she was working with a focus that shut out everything else, the cold, the fear, the sound of 7 men quietly arguing about what to do next. Coulter watched her draw for a moment before turning back to the group. Ghost. Your guy. Where are we? He's in. Name's Ren. He's driving up from Philly. Should be here by tonight. He needs a clean laptop and a secure location. Harlan's got a cabin near Kettle Creek, Boone said. Off-grid. No cell service. You have to know the road to find it. That's where we go, Coulter said. All of us? Harlan's voice was tight. He'd been quiet since they left the garage, quieter than usual, and there was something working behind his eyes that Coulter recognized. The slow calculation of a man measuring risk against loyalty and finding the math harder than he expected. All of us, Coulter said. Harlan stood up from the crate he'd been sitting on. He was 51 years old, the oldest member of the club, a man who had survived 2 deployments in Afghanistan and a divorce that cost him his house, his savings, and his relationship with 2 adult sons who hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. He had a face like cracked leather and eyes that missed nothing. Coulter, Harlan said slowly, I need to say something, and I need the room to hear it. Say it. We've been a club for 6 years. In 6 years, we've never had police at our gate. We've never had government vehicles tracking us. We've never been running in the middle of the night through tunnels with a child we have no legal right to protect. He paused. I believe the girl. I believe Mercer's dirty. But believing it and dying for it are 2 different things, and some of the men in this room have more to lose than others. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either understanding or violence. Boone stepped forward. You saying you want to walk? I'm saying I want to know the plan, the real plan, not hold and hope, not find someone with a conscience. A plan. Because right now we are 7 men with no legal standing, no resources, and no allies, hiding a child from a man who has all 3, and the clock is running. He wasn't wrong. Every man in that shack knew he wasn't wrong, and that was what made it so dangerous, because being right and being afraid look exactly the same when you're standing in a frozen shack at dawn with your brothers, and neither one forgives easily. Coulter looked at Harlan for a long time. The wind pushed through the gaps in the walls and stirred the snow on the floor. Ivy's pencil scratched softly against paper. You're right, Coulter said. You deserve a plan. Here it is. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and held it up. Ren cracks this tonight. Whatever's on it. Financial records, names, routes, victims. We take it to someone outside Mercer's reach. Not local, not state, federal. I have a contact at the DOJ from my service days. A woman named Annalise Drummond. She ran prosecutions against military contractors in Afghanistan. She's hard and she's clean, and she doesn't owe anyone in this state a thing. If what's on this drive is what the girl says it is, Drummond can move on it. Warrants, indictments, protection for Ivy. And if the drive is nothing, Harlan pressed, if it's spreadsheets and vacation photos, and we've just made ourselves fugitives for a dead end, then we find another way. That's not a plan, Coulter. That's faith. It's what I've got. Harlan stared at him. The 2 men had ridden together for 5 years. They had shared whiskey on bad nights and silence on worse ones. They had held each other upright in VA waiting rooms and at funerals for men who came home from war and couldn't survive the peace. There was love between them, the hard, unspoken, calloused love of men who had chosen each other as family after the world stripped everything else away. All right, Harlan said finally. All right, but if this falls apart, Coulter, if this goes sideways and men start dying, that's on you, not the club. You. I know. Good. Because I need you to feel that weight. I need it sitting on your chest every time you make a decision. Because the last man who led me into something this deep without a plan was my battalion commander in Helmand, and half my platoon came home in boxes. The words landed like a fist. Not because they were cruel, Harlan wasn't cruel, but because they were true. And in the Iron Saints, truth was the only currency that couldn't be counterfeited. Coulter nodded once. Heard. They moved. The ride to Harlan's cabin took 4 hours through frozen mountain roads that twisted through bare forests and along ridge lines where the wind was so sharp it felt like being cut with glass. Ivy rode with Coulter again, pressed against his back, her face hidden inside the hood of a jacket 3 sizes too large that Ghost had given her. She didn't complain about the cold. She didn't ask how far or how long. She sat behind a man she'd known for less than 12 hours and held on, and her silence was the loudest thing on the road. They reached the cabin at noon. It sat at the end of a dirt track surrounded by hemlock and bare oak, a single-story structure built from rough-cut lumber with a stone chimney and a tin roof that rattled in the wind. No power lines, no mailbox, no neighbors for 6 miles in any direction. Harlan had bought it after his divorce with the last of his savings, not as a retreat, but as a place to disappear to when the world became too loud and the memories became too close. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and dust. Harlan started a fire in the stone fireplace while Boone swept the floor and Reno checked the perimeter. Ghost set up a makeshift medical station on the kitchen table. Habit, pure habit, the reflexes of a combat medic who never stopped preparing for casualties even when no battle was planned. Ivy sat cross-legged on the floor near the fire and continued drawing. The warmth seemed to unlock something in her. Her shoulders dropped. Her grip on the pencil eased. And after 20 minutes, without looking up, she spoke. He's been doing it for 3 years. The room went quiet. Coulter, who had been standing at the window watching the tree line, turned slowly. 3 years, Ivy said. The trucks come at night. To the construction sites. They bring people. Women, mostly. Sometimes kids. Not American kids. From somewhere else. They stay in the buildings, the ones that aren't finished yet, and then they leave, and nobody talks about it. She said it the way you describe the weather, flat, factual, the voice of a child who had learned that the monstrous and the mundane could share the same house, the same dinner table, the same good night. Ghost sat down slowly on the floor across from her. Ivy, how do you know this? Because I hear everything. My room is above his office. The floor has cracks. I can hear every phone call, every meeting, every time someone comes to the door late at night. She paused. He thinks I'm stupid. He thinks because I'm a kid I don't understand. But I understand all of it. Deck leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his face a mask of something between rage and grief. 3 years, he repeated. She's been living above that for 3 years. My mom doesn't know, Ivy added, and for the first time her voice cracked, just a hairline fracture in the flat calm she'd maintained since the diner. She thinks he's a good man. She thinks the money comes from the contracts. She loves him. She really does. And I can't... She stopped, swallowed, pressed the pencil hard against the paper. I can't tell her what he is because it would break her. Coulter crossed the room and knelt beside Ivy. His knees cracked against the wooden floor. The fire popped and hissed behind him. You shouldn't have had to carry this, he said. But I did. Yeah, you did. And that's the part I'm going to fix. Ivy looked at him. Her eyes were brown and clear and terrifyingly steady. You can't fix 3 years. No, I can't, but I can make sure there isn't a fourth. Outside, the wind screamed through the hemlocks and snow began to fall again, heavier now, burying the dirt track and the tire marks and any evidence that anyone had come this way. The cabin felt like a ship adrift in a white sea, isolated, fragile, held together by timber and fire and the stubborn refusal of 7 broken men to let 1 child drown. Wren arrived at 9:15 that night. He came in a rusted Honda Civic with Pennsylvania plates and a trunk full of hardware, 3 laptops, a signal jammer, a portable hard drive array, and enough caffeine pills to keep a platoon awake for a week. Wren himself was a thin, twitchy man in his early 30s with deep-set eyes and the permanent expression of someone who assumed every room was bugged. He had served with Ghost in Syria, running communications for a forward operating base, and he had come home with a skill set that the private sector paid handsomely for and a paranoia that the private sector couldn't cure. He shook Ghost's hand. He nodded at Coulter. He ignored everyone else. Flash drive, he said. Let me see it. Coulter handed it over. Wren turned it in his fingers, studied the casing, sniffed it once, an odd habit, and then sat down at the kitchen table, opened a laptop, and disappeared into the screen. For 2 hours, nobody spoke to him. Wren worked in silence, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a speed that was almost violent, his eyes scanning lines of data that scrolled faster than anyone else in the room could read. The fire crackled, coffee was made and remade. The Saint sat in various positions around the cabin. Deck on the porch with the Mossberg, Boone by the back door, Harlan in a chair near the window, Reno sketching quietly, Ghost checking on Ivy, who had fallen asleep on a pile of blankets near the hearth. At 11:30 p.m., Wren stopped typing. He leaned back in his chair. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. And when he looked up at Coulter, his face was different. The twitchiness was gone. In its place was something hard and cold and very, very still. "You need to see this," Wren said. Coulter walked to the table. The screen showed a spreadsheet, rows and columns of numbers, dates, names, and codes. To a civilian eye, it looked like a construction company's financial ledger. But Wren had cracked the encryption layer beneath it, and now a second dataset was visible, overlaid on the first like a ghost image. "Shell companies," Wren said, pointing. 14 of them, all registered in Delaware, all feeding into Mercer's main contracting firm. The money flows through the construction projects, invoices for materials that were never purchased, labor costs for workers who don't exist, and then out to accounts in 3 different countries. How much? Over 47 million in the past 3 years. The number hung in the air like smoke. But that's not the worst part, Wren said. He clicked through 2 more screens. These files, shipping manifests, fake customs documents, passenger logs. They correlate with IC detention transfers that were rerouted through Blackwater Ridge's transit system. Mercer wasn't just laundering money through construction projects. He was using them as way stations. Way stations for what? Deck asked from the doorway. Wren looked at him. People. Trafficked individuals. Women and minors mostly. Routed through unfinished construction sites that Mercer controlled, held temporarily, and then moved to final destinations through a network that... He stopped, scrolled down. That is protected by at least 11 members of local and county law enforcement whose names, badge numbers, and payment records are all right here. Silence. Total, annihilating silence. Coulter stared at the screen. The fire cracked behind him. In the corner of the room, Ivy slept with her backpack pressed against her chest, her face soft and unguarded in the warmth. And above her head on the rough timber wall, a shadow moved as the flames danced, and it looked, just for a moment, like the outline of something reaching for her. "She's been sleeping above this," Ghost whispered. "Every night, for 3 years. A 10-year-old girl. Sleeping 20 feet above a trafficking operation." Nobody responded. What was there to say? Boone was the first to move. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a measure of bourbon, drank it in one swallow, set the glass down, and turned to face the room. "This changes everything," he said. "This isn't a corrupt contractor anymore. This is federal-level organized crime with law enforcement participation. If we go to Coulter's DOJ contact with this, we're not just filing a complaint. We're detonating a bomb under 11 cops, 14 shell companies, and a trafficking network that crosses state lines. And every single person connected to it will do anything, to make sure this drive never sees the inside of a courtroom." "Meaning us," Harlan said from his chair. "Meaning us. Meaning her." Boone pointed toward Ivy. "We are now the only people standing between that evidence and the people it would destroy. And they know it. They know we have her. They know we have the drive. After tonight, there is no walking away. There is no giving her back and pretending this didn't happen. We are in this until it's over." He looked at each man in turn. Deck, Ghost, Harlan, Reno, Wren, Coulter. "So I need to hear it," Boone said. "From each of you, right now, because after this moment, there's no door behind us anymore." The fire popped. The wind howled. Ivy slept. Deck spoke first. "I'm in." Ghost. "In." Reno nodded once. Harlan stared at the floor for a long time. His hands were clenched on his knees. His jaw moved like he was chewing on something that wouldn't break down. Then he exhaled. "In." Wren shrugged. "I was in the moment I saw the data. This is the kind of thing I left the service to fight." Every eye turned to Coulter. He stood at the table with his hands flat on the wood, the glow of the laptop screen cutting his face into angles of light and shadow. He looked at the drive. He looked at the screen. He looked at Ivy, asleep near the fire, clutching her backpack in her small hands. "We make copies," he said. 3. One stays with Wren on encrypted hardware. One goes to Drummond at the DOJ. One gets buried somewhere only I know. He straightened. "And tomorrow morning I make the call. We hand this to the feds and we pray they move fast enough." "And if they don't?" Harlan asked. Coulter didn't answer. He didn't need to. Every man in that cabin already knew what happened if the system failed them again. They'd been failed before. They knew the shape of it, the taste of it, the way it sat in your stomach like swallowed glass. But this time, there was a child sleeping by the fire. And that changed the math in ways none of them could calculate. The cabin settled into watchful quiet after midnight. Deck took first watch on the porch. Boone slept in a chair with his boots on. Wren kept working, his face lit by the screen, copying and encrypting. Reno sat near the door with a rifle across his knees, his eyes half closed but not sleeping. Never fully sleeping. Not since Bagram, not since the night his convoy was hit, and he spent 7 hours in a ditch listening to a man he couldn't reach calling for help until the voice stopped. Coulter stood at the window and watched the dark. His phone, the burner, buzzed at 12:47 a.m. He looked at the screen. The message was from an unknown number. It was a photograph. The image showed a man hanging from his wrists in a concrete room. The man was shirtless, bloodied, his head hanging forward, his body covered in marks that were systematic and deliberate and designed not to kill but to communicate. The man's face was swollen and bruised beyond easy recognition, but Coulter recognized the tattoo on the man's left forearm. An eagle clutching a rifle. The same tattoo every Iron Saint carried. The man in the photograph was Jamie Ghost Perez. No, that was wrong. Ghost was here, in the cabin, sleeping near Ivy. Coulter looked again, closer. The tattoo was the same, but the arm was different, thinner, lighter. And then he saw the second tattoo, the one on the right shoulder, a set of numbers that he recognized with a sickness that rose through his body like ice water. It wasn't Ghost, it was Tyler Briggs. Patch, the youngest prospect the Iron Saints had ever accepted. A 22-year-old kid from Allentown who had been patching in for 3 months, running errands, learning the ropes, earning his place. Patch had stayed behind in Blackwater Ridge when the rest of the club moved Ivy. He'd volunteered to watch the garage. Coulter had let him. Beneath the photograph, 3 lines of text. 12 hours expired 6 hours ago. Return the girl in the drive. Or the next photo is his hands. You have until dawn. Coulter's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic casing creaked. His vision narrowed. His breathing stopped, then restarted in a pattern he hadn't used since combat. Slow, controlled, 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The window glass fogged with each exhale. He turned and looked across the cabin at his brothers. Deck on the porch, Boone asleep in the chair, Ghost curled on the floor near a child he'd sworn to protect, Harlan in the shadows, Reno at the door, Wren behind the screen. Every one of them had just crossed a line they could never uncross. The evidence was real. The enemy was vast. A boy was bleeding in a concrete room because Coulter Vane had made a choice. And now, with dawn 3 hours away and a dead man's deadline ticking towards 0, Coulter had to decide. Save the brother hanging in that room, or protect the child sleeping by the fire. He couldn't do both. And for the first time since Fallujah, Coulter Vane had no idea what to do next. Coulter stood at the cabin window for 11 minutes without moving. He counted each one. An old combat trick. When the world collapses, count something. Seconds, breaths, heartbeats. It doesn't fix anything, but it keeps the animal part of your brain from taking the wheel. And right now, the animal part of Coulter Vane's brain was screaming at a volume that could shatter bone. The photograph of Patch glowed on the phone screen in his hand. 22 years old, a kid from Allentown who still called his mother every Sunday, and who had once driven 3 hours in a snowstorm to bring Deck a birthday cake because he'd heard Deck say, once, quietly, that nobody had celebrated his birthday since he lost his leg. That kid was now hanging from his wrists in a concrete room with blood on his chest and fear in his eyes. And it was Coulter's fault. He had left Patch behind. He had made the calculation, the cold, tactical, wartime calculation, that protecting Ivy was worth more than watching the garage, and now a boy was paying for that math in flesh. The 12th minute ended. Coulter turned from the window. Deck was still on the porch. The cabin was quiet except for the fire, and Wren's keyboard, and the wind that never stopped. Coulter crossed the room, stepping over Ghost's sleeping form, stepping past Ivy, who lay curled near the hearth with her backpack clutched to her chest like a life vest, and he pushed open the front door and stepped into the frozen dark. Deck looked up from the porch railing. The Mossberg lay across his thighs. His breath turned white. His eyes found Coulter's face, and something shifted in them immediately. The recognition of a man who had spent years reading the silence between other men's words. "What happened?" Deck said. Coulter held out the phone. Deck took it. He looked at the screen. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then his hand tightened around the phone so hard the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables, and a sound came from somewhere deep in his chest. Not a word, not a groan, something older than language. Something that lived in the basement of a man's soul, where the things too heavy to carry were stored. Patch, Deck whispered. Yeah. When? The photo came in 12 minutes ago. Timestamp on the image is 3 hours old. They took him sometime after we left the garage. Deck stared at the photo. His jaw worked. His prosthetic leg clicked once against the porch boards. An involuntary shift, the body's way of preparing to move even when the mind hasn't decided where. He was supposed to be safe, Deck said. I told him. I looked that kid in the eye, and I told him the garage was the safest place in the world. I know. You left him there, Coulter. The words came out flat, not accusatory. Worse, resigned. The voice of a man stating a fact he wished wasn't true. I did, Coulter said. You left a 22-year-old prospect alone in a garage that 12 armed men already knew the location of. You made a call, and this is what it cost. Coulter said nothing. There was nothing to say. Deck was right. The math was simple and the answer was blood, and no amount of justification would change the equation. They stood on the porch in the killing cold, two men staring at a photograph of a boy they had failed, and the silence between them was the heaviest thing either of them had carried since the wars they had survived, and the people they hadn't. Wake the others, Coulter said. The cabin became a war room in 6 minutes. Boone came awake with his hand on his .45 before his eyes were fully open. Harlan materialized from the shadows near the back wall like he'd never been asleep at all. Reno set down his rifle and cracked his knuckles. Ghost was the last to wake, and when he saw the photograph on the phone that Deck passed around the circle, his hands, those steady, surgeon-steady medic's hands, began to shake. No, Ghost said. No, no, no. I told Patch to lock the doors and stay in the back room and not open for anyone. I told him. He's 22, Harlan cut in, his voice dry as gravel. 22-year-old kids don't hide. They open doors because they think they can handle what's on the other side. The phone reached Wren, who studied the photograph with clinical detachment. The background, the lighting, the angle, the quality. His eyes narrowed. Concrete walls, Wren said. Commercial fluorescent fixtures, ceiling mounted, the kind you see in warehouses or industrial spaces. No windows visible. The chains he's hanging from are attached to a ceiling-mounted I-beam, standard in loading bay construction. He zoomed in on the edge of the frame. There, bottom right corner. Partial logo on a crate, blue and white. That's Mercer Development Corp. This is one of his construction sites. Which one? Coulter asked. Could be any of them. He's got 14 active projects in Blackwater Ridge alone. Can you narrow it down? Wren looked at the metadata on the image file. The EXIF data's been stripped, intentionally. These people know what they're doing. He paused. But the fluorescent fixtures, those are T8 bulbs, 4 foot, cool white. Commercial grade. And the I-beam spacing suggests a building with at least a 40-foot clear span. That narrows it to 3, maybe 4 of Mercer's sites. The waterfront warehouse complex, the old cannery redevelopment, the transit depot, and the steel fabrication plant on Route 6. 4 buildings, Boone said. 7 men, 1 night. 6 men, Coulter said. Someone stays with Ivy. The room shifted. Every eye moved to the corner where Ivy slept, then back to Coulter. The calculation was visible on every face. The terrible arithmetic of war. The equation that asks how many lives one life is worth and never gives you a clean answer. Ghost spoke first, and his voice had a quality that Coulter had never heard in it before. The sound of a man whose hands had stopped shaking because something harder than fear had taken over. I'll stay with Ivy, Ghost said. Reno stays with me. That gives you 5 for the search. 1 man per site, 1 man in reserve. You sure? Coulter asked. Ghost looked at the photograph one more time. Then he looked at Ivy. Then he closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had been settled inside him. Some old argument between the man he was and the man he was afraid of becoming, resolved in the space of a single breath. Patch would want the girls safe, Ghost said. He'd say it himself if he could. So yeah, I'm sure. Coulter held his gaze. Then he nodded. We leave in 20 minutes. Wren, You stay here with Ghost and Reno. Keep working the data. If you can narrow the location further, text the burner. Deck, Boone, Harlan. You're with me. We split at the ridge and take the sites one at a time. No radios, burner phones only. If you find Patch, you text one word, found. If you run into hostiles, you text one word, hot. And if it goes sideways, he paused. If it goes sideways, you get out, you get back here. You protect the girl. That is the priority. Not me, not the club. Her. Coulter? Deck started. That's the order, Deck. Her. Deck's mouth closed. His jaw locked. He looked like a man swallowing a live coal and trying not to let it show. The Saints moved out at 4:15 a.m. into a darkness so complete it felt like the world had forgotten what light was. The temperature had dropped below zero, and the air burned the inside of Coulter's lungs with each breath. 4 Harleys rumbled to life in the frozen clearing behind the cabin, their exhaust plumes rising white against the black sky. They rode without headlights for the first 2 miles, navigating by memory and the faint gray line of the road against the snow. 4 dark shapes cutting through a dark world like ghosts, heading toward something that might kill them. At the ridge, they split. Harlan took the north route toward the old cannery. Boone took the south fork toward the transit depot. Deck and Coulter stayed together for the descent into the valley, heading for the waterfront warehouse complex, the largest of Mercer's sites, the one closest to the river, the one where the shipping manifests on the flash drive showed the most activity. They rode in silence. The only sound was engine and wind and the occasional crack of frozen branches breaking under the weight of ice. Coulter's hands were numb inside his gloves. His face was raw. His back ached from the cold and the tension and the weight of decisions that had started to feel like they were made of iron. Deck pulled alongside him at a stoplight on the edge of town. A dead intersection, no cars, the traffic light cycling through its colors for nobody. Red, green, yellow, red again. The neon from a closed liquor store splashed color across their leather and chrome. Coulter, Deck said over the idle of the engines. His voice was tight, controlled. There's something I haven't told you. Coulter looked at him. The red light painted half of Deck's face in crimson. What? 3 weeks ago, before any of this, I got a call from a man named Ray Sutter. Said he was a private investigator working for a client in Blackwater Ridge who needed security consulting. Wanted to know about the club, how many members, where we operated, what our facility looked like. I told him to go to hell and hung up. Coulter's stomach dropped. You didn't tell me. I didn't tell you because it sounded like nothing. A PI sniffing around biker clubs. It happens. People hire them to check out tenants, neighbors, guys their daughters are dating. I figured it was routine. And now? Deck's expression was granite. And now I'm thinking Ray Sutter was working for Wade Mercer. And I'm thinking Mercer's been watching us for weeks, maybe longer. He didn't find the girl and then find us. He already knew where we were. He already had the layout of our garage, our habits, our numbers. He was already inside our perimeter before Ivy ever walked through that diner door. The words landed in Coulter's chest like shrapnel. Every assumption he had made, that Mercer was reacting to their movements, that the club had a head start, that the garage had been safe, all of it collapsed in a single sentence. Mercer hadn't been chasing them. Mercer had been ahead of them. Every step. From the beginning. The firebomb, Coulter said slowly. The SUVs at the fence. The photo of Patch. None of it was responsive. It was all planned. He already knew the garage. He already knew the tunnel. He let us run because running kept us predictable. Deck nodded. And Nolan showing up at the fence, that wasn't a retrieval attempt. That was a census. He was counting heads, seeing who was inside and who wasn't. Coulter's hands tightened on the handlebars until his knuckles went white inside his gloves. The light turned green. Neither of them moved. Why didn't you tell me, Deck? Because I didn't think it mattered. It matters now. I know it does. That's why I'm telling you. 3 weeks. He's had 3 weeks on us. Yeah. Which means the cabin might already be compromised. The realization hit them at the same moment, and the same thought crossed both their faces. Ghost, Reno, Wren, and Ivy, sitting in a cabin in the woods that Harlan had bought in his own name, with an address on a deed that any PI worth his fee could find in an afternoon. Coulter pulled the burner from his pocket. His fingers were stiff with cold. He dialed Ghost's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4. No answer. He dialed again. Ringing, 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 nothing. The green light cycled to yellow, then red. The neon from the liquor store buzzed and flickered, casting shadows that jumped and shifted across the empty intersection. A car passed on the cross street. A dark sedan, moving slow, its windows tinted, its plates obscured by road salt and grime. It didn't stop. But it didn't speed up either. It just glided through the intersection like a fish moving through black water, and then it was gone. Coulter, Deck said. His voice had changed. The controlled tension was gone. What replaced it was something rawer and more dangerous. The voice of a man whose combat instincts had just activated with the full-body certainty of someone who has been ambushed before and recognizes the shape of it. I see it, Coulter said. That's the third dark sedan we've passed since the ridge. I know. They're boxing us. Coulter looked down the road ahead. 3 blocks away, a pair of headlights sat motionless at the curb. To the right, on a side street, another vehicle idled in the shadow of a closed hardware store. Behind them, the sedan that had just passed was now turning, slowly, casually, back toward the intersection. 3 vehicles. 3 directions. 1 remaining. Coulter's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Nice night for a ride, Mr. Vane. You should have taken the deal. His blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Move, Coulter said. Now. They hit the throttle simultaneously, the Harleys roaring to life with a sound that tore through the silent town like an explosion. Coulter took the south lane, Deck the north, splitting apart like shrapnel, and behind them the 3 vehicles surged forward in unison, headlights blazing, engines screaming, closing the distance with a coordinated precision that confirmed everything Coulter feared. This wasn't law enforcement. Cops don't run silent boxes at 4:30 in the morning. Cops don't coordinate 3 vehicles with military timing. This was private. This was Mercer's money buying the kind of operational expertise that didn't carry badges or answer to oversight. Coulter took a hard right down an alley between 2 brick buildings, the Harley's handlebars clearing the walls by inches on each side. Sparks flew as his foot pegs scraped the pavement. Behind him, one of the vehicles tried to follow, but its width caught the alley mouth and it ground to a stop, its horn blaring into the dark. He came out the other side onto a residential street, dark houses, dead lawns, a streetlight with a broken bulb, and opened the throttle full. The engine howled. The front wheel lifted for a fraction of a second before slamming back down. Wind tore at his face. Snow stung his eyes. His phone buzzed again. Deck this time. 1 word, clear. Deck had gotten out. Good. But the others, Harlan, Boone, were still out there, heading to their assigned sites, unaware that the entire operation was compromised. Coulter pulled over behind an abandoned gas station on the western edge of town, killed the engine, and sat in the dark breathing clouds of white into the frozen air. His hands shook. His heart hammered. The adrenaline tasted like copper and battery acid. He dialed Ghost again. This time, on the 6th ring, someone answered. But it wasn't Ghost. Mr. Vane. The voice was calm, measured, with the polished diction of a man who had spent decades making his words sound like reasonable things. My name is Wade Mercer. I believe you have something that belongs to me. The world stopped. Coulter's grip on the phone was so tight he could feel the tendons in his hands straining. The silence on the line was thick and absolute, the kind of silence that exists in the space between a trigger being pulled and the bullet arriving. Where are they? Coulter said. Your friends are fine. For the moment. The young woman with the medical supplies put up an admirable effort. The quiet one with the tattoos, less so. And the nervous gentleman with the laptops is currently explaining to my colleagues why encrypted data is not, in fact, as permanent as he seems to believe. Ghost. Reno. Wren. All 3. Taken. And Ivy. The girl, Coulter said. His voice was a whisper now. Not from weakness, from the effort of keeping something enormous and destructive locked behind his teeth. The girl is with me, Mercer said. She's unharmed. She will remain unharmed as long as you listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Let me hear her voice. A pause. A rustling sound. And then, small and distant and achingly clear through the phone's tiny speaker, Ivy's voice. Coulter? I'm here, Ivy. I'm sorry, I tried to. They came through the back. Through the woods. There were so many of them, and Ghost tried to. The phone was pulled away. Mercer's voice returned, smooth as oil. She's a brave child, tragically misguided, but brave. Now. Here is what's going to happen, Mr. Vane. You are going to bring me the original flash drive. You are going to bring me every copy your people made, and you are going to come alone. No club, no weapons, no calls to anyone outside this conversation. In exchange, I will release your men. I will release the girl into the custody of Child Protective Services, and this entire unfortunate episode will end quietly. And if I don't? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long, but felt like an hour. Mr. Vane, I am a patient man. I have built a career on patience, but I did not build a $47 million enterprise by allowing complications to persist. You are a complication. Your club is a complication. The girl is a complication. And complications, when they cannot be resolved through negotiation, are resolved through other means. Another pause. You have until sunrise. That gives you approximately 90 minutes. I will text you an address. The line went dead. Coulter sat on the motorcycle behind the abandoned gas station in the frozen dark and felt the world contract to a single point. A point the size of a flash drive, the weight of a child's voice saying his name through a phone speaker, the shape of a choice that had no good outcomes and no time left. His phone buzzed. Deck. I heard from Boone. He's clear. Harlan too. We're regrouping at the switching station. Where are you? They have Ivy. Silence. They have Ghost. Reno. Ren. They hit the cabin. Mercer called me on Ghost's phone. He wants the drive and the copies. Alone. By sunrise. More silence. Longer this time. When Deck spoke, his voice was stripped of everything except the one thing that war teaches men to hold on to when everything else is gone. Function. Where are you? Deck repeated. West side, behind the old Sunoco. Don't move. Deck arrived in 14 minutes. Boone and Harlan came together 7 minutes after that. 4 men in a frozen parking lot behind a dead gas station, their Harleys ticking as the engines cooled, their breath rising white, their faces carved from shadow and fury and the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body. Coulter told them everything, the phone call, Mercer's voice, Ivy's voice, the demand, the deadline. When he finished, Harlan spoke first. He's not going to let them go. No, Coulter said. Even if you give him everything, the drive, the copies, yourself on a silver platter, he's not going to release witnesses. That's not how men like Mercer operate. He'll take the drive, eliminate every person who's seen the data, and bury the evidence so deep it'll take 20 years to find, if they ever find it. I know. So walking in alone is suicide. I know that too. Then what? Coulter reached into the inside pocket of his leather cut. His fingers found something he'd placed there 3 hours ago, before they left the cabin, before the ride, before any of this. A second flash drive. Smaller than the original. Black casing with a strip of electrical tape around the middle. Wren made 3 copies, Coulter said. 1 he kept. 1 was supposed to go to Drummond at the DOJ, and 1, he held up the drive. 1 he gave to me, in case everything else failed. Boone stared at the drive. Mercer doesn't know about that one. No, he thinks he has all the copies. He has Wren, he has the hardware. He thinks the data is contained. But it's not. It's not. Deck's eyes narrowed. So what are you thinking? Coulter looked at the 3 men standing in front of him. His brothers. The last one standing. Everything else? The garage, the cabin, the plan, the careful architecture of safety they'd tried to build around one terrified child. All of it was gone. Burned. Taken. Collapsed. What remained was 4 men, 4 motorcycles, 1 flash drive, and 90 minutes. I'm thinking we don't play his game, Coulter said. He wants me to walk in alone and trade. That's his board, his rules, his checkmate. But he made one mistake. What mistake? Coulter looked each of them in the eye, one at a time. Deck, Boone, Harlan, the men who stayed, the men who always stayed. He thinks we're afraid of losing, Coulter said. He thinks because we're outnumbered and outgunned and cornered, we'll trade everything to survive. But he doesn't understand what we are. We're not survivors, Deck. We stopped being survivors the night Ivy walked through that diner door. We became something else. What? The last wall. The words settled in the frozen air like stones sinking into dark water. Nobody spoke. Nobody argued. Nobody asked for clarification, because every man in that parking lot had been a wall before. In Fallujah, in Kandahar, in Helmand, and they knew what it meant. It meant you stopped retreating. It meant the ground you were standing on was the last ground there was. It meant the people behind you mattered more than the body you were standing in. Coulter outlined the plan in 4 minutes. It was simple. Simple was all they had time for, and simple was what worked when the margins were this thin. Harlan, you take the third copy of the drive. You ride south. You don't stop until you reach Annalise Drummond's office in Philadelphia. If she's not there, you find her. If you can't find her, you walk into the nearest FBI field office and you hand them the drive and you tell them everything. Names, dates, badge numbers, all of it. Harlan nodded once. Deck, Boone, you're with me. We go to whatever address Mercer sends. We walk in. And we buy time. Buy time for what? Boone asked. For Harlan to reach Drummond. For the feds to move. For the data to get into hands that Mercer can't reach. He paused. We don't need to win the fight, Boone. We just need to keep them busy long enough for the fight to become irrelevant. And Ivy? Coulter's face went still. Completely, terrifyingly still. The face of a man who has looked at every possible future and found that none of them are painless, and all of them require something he isn't sure he has left to give. I'll get her out, he said, or I won't walk out at all. Deck stared at him. That's not a plan, Coulter. That's a death wish. Maybe. But she called my name, Deck, through the phone. She said my name like she believed I was coming. Like she still trusted. His voice cracked. One hairline fracture in the concrete. He closed his eyes, opened them. I can't be the second man in her life who fails her. I won't. The air between the 4 men was charged with something that had no name. Not courage, not loyalty, not even love, but something harder and older and more fundamental. The thing that makes men walk into burning buildings. The thing that makes soldiers throw themselves on grenades. The thing that lives in the space between who you are and who you refuse to be. Harlan reached out and gripped Coulter's forearm. The grip was iron. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. I'll make it, Harlan said. The drive reaches Drummond. I swear it. I know you will. Harlan held the grip for 3 seconds. Then he released it, mounted his Harley, kicked the engine to life, and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. His taillight disappeared down the road like a red ember swallowed by the dark. 3 men remained. Coulter's phone buzzed. The address from Mercer, a warehouse on the waterfront. Pier 11. The same pier that appeared in the shipping manifests on the flash drive. The hub of the trafficking network. The center of everything Mercer had built in the shadows of Blackwater Ridge. He was bringing them to the heart of his empire. The place where he felt strongest. The place where every advantage was his. Coulter looked at the address. Then he looked at Deck and Boone. 90 minutes is down to 60, he said. We ride. 3 Harleys fired in the dark. 3 engines roared through the dead streets of Blackwater Ridge at 5:10 in the morning as the first faint gray line of dawn crept along the eastern ridge like a wound that wouldn't close. The town was silent. The houses were dark. Somewhere a dog barked once and then went quiet, as if even the animals understood that something was moving through the night that was bigger than sound. They rode toward the waterfront with the river on their left, black and frozen along the edges, its current still moving beneath the ice like a pulse beneath dead skin. The warehouse district rose ahead of them, massive shapes of steel and concrete silhouetted against the gray sky, cranes reaching into the dark like the arms of giants, shipping containers stacked in rows like the walls of a fortress. Pier 11 was the last structure before the river, a long, low warehouse with corrugated steel walls and a loading bay that faced the water. Floodlights mounted on the roof cast pools of white light across the concrete apron outside, and in those pools vehicles were parked, SUVs, sedans, a panel van with Mercer Development Corp printed on the side. A dozen men stood in the cold, some in tactical gear, some in plain clothes, all of them armed, all of them watching the road. Coulter killed his headlight 2 blocks out. Deck and Boone followed. They coasted the last 100 yards on momentum alone, the engines rumbling low, and stopped at the edge of the floodlight's reach. One of the armed men walked forward. He stopped 20 feet from Coulter's front wheel and held up a hand. Drive, copies, walk in alone. Coulter sat on his motorcycle and looked past the man toward the warehouse doors. They were open, and inside, beneath rows of fluorescent lights, he could see shapes, people, crates, the hard geometry of a space designed for moving things that were never meant to be seen. And somewhere in that space, a 10-year-old girl who had trusted him enough to say his name through a phone held by the man who had destroyed her life. He reached into his cut, pulled out the original flash drive, the real one, the one Ivy had stolen from her stepfather's desk, and held it up between two fingers. The girl first, Coulter said. I see her walk out, you get the drive. The man spoke into a radio. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Then the warehouse doors opened wider, and Wade Mercer walked out. He was taller than Coulter expected. 6'3", maybe 6'4", with the broad shoulders and easy posture of a man who had spent his entire life being the biggest person in every room. He wore a dark overcoat over a suit, no tie, and his silver hair was combed back from a face that belonged on campaign posters. Strong jaw, clear eyes, a smile that radiated competence and warmth, and absolutely nothing real. He looked like a man who built hospitals. He looked like a man who shook hands with senators. He looked like a man who could stand in a room full of stolen lives and see nothing but numbers on a spreadsheet. He was holding Ivy's hand. The girl walked beside him in the same oversized jacket Ghost had given her. Her backpack was gone. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes fixed on Coulter with an intensity that burned across the distance between them like a signal fire. Mr. Vane, Mercer said, his voice carrying easily across the concrete. Thank you for being reasonable. Coulter didn't respond. His eyes were on Ivy. Only Ivy. The drive, please, Mercer said. He extended his free hand. Let her walk to me first. Mercer smiled, the smile of a man holding all the cards and enjoying the view. I'm afraid that's not how this works. The drive first, then the girl, then your men inside. Then we all go home and pretend this week never happened. And if I say no? Mercer's smile didn't change, but his grip on Ivy's hand tightened. The girl winced, one small involuntary flinch that she tried to hide and couldn't. Coulter saw it, and something inside him, something that had been holding together through the diner, and the garage, and the cabin, and the ride, and the cold, and the fear, and the impossible weight of every decision he'd made since a barefoot girl walked into his life, that something finally broke. Not apart, not down, open. Like a door that had been bolted shut for years suddenly swinging wide, and behind it was not grief or rage or the ghost of a daughter he couldn't save, but something simpler and more terrifying. Clarity, the absolute diamond-hard clarity of a man who has finally stopped choosing between who he is and who he needs to be. Coulter Vane dismounted his motorcycle. He held the flash drive in his right hand. He took one step forward, then another, and behind him, in the cold and the dark and the last minutes before dawn, the sound of deck racking the Mossberg cut through the silence like a sentence being finished. Coulter took a third step toward Mercer, and the sound behind him. The cold mechanical rack of deck's Mossberg froze every armed man on the pier. 12 weapons came up simultaneously. Safeties clicked off in a chain reaction that sounded like bones cracking. The floodlights turned everything white and sharp-edged, every shadow a blade, every breath a cloud that hung in the frozen air like something waiting to become a ghost. Mercer didn't flinch. His hand stayed locked around Ivy's. His smile stayed fixed. But his eyes, those clear campaigner's eyes, shifted to the space behind Coulter where Deck sat on his Harley with 12-gauge steel pointed at the center of the world. That, Mercer said calmly, is a very poor decision. Maybe, Coulter said. He stopped walking, 10 feet from Mercer, close enough to see the girl's face in detail, the paleness, the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes burned with something that wasn't fear anymore but something fiercer, something that looked like defiance held together with wire and willpower. But here's the thing about poor decisions, Mercer. We've been making them our whole lives. One more won't kill us. It might. Then we'll be even, because that girl's been dying slow in your house for 3 years, and nobody noticed. The words landed. Mercer's smile didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. A recalculation, a reassessment, the machinery of a man who controlled outcomes adjusting to a variable he hadn't anticipated. Men who were willing to die were the hardest variable in any equation. You couldn't buy them. You couldn't threaten them. You could only kill them, and killing them in front of witnesses created complications that even $47 million couldn't always erase. Mr. Vane, Mercer said, you're an intelligent man. You served your country. You understand leverage. So, let me explain the leverage as it currently stands. Inside that warehouse, I have 3 of your men. Outside this warehouse, I have 12 armed professionals who are very good at what they do. You have what? A shotgun, 2 pistols, and a death wish. He tilted his head. Those aren't odds. Those are funeral arrangements. You're right, Coulter said. But funerals make noise, and noise is the one thing you can't afford right now. Mercer's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, a hairline adjustment that told Coulter everything he needed to know. That beneath the suit and the smile and the senator handshakes, Wade Mercer was afraid. Not of 3 bikers on a frozen pier. He was afraid of exposure. He was afraid of the data on the flash drive reaching someone he couldn't control. I was afraid that the empire he had built in the shadows would be dragged into the light, and the light would do what light always does to things that grow in the dark. Here's what's going to happen, Coulter said. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had stopped negotiating and started dictating. You're going to let Ivy walk to me, right now. Then you're going to bring my men out, all 3, alive, unharmed, and then I'm going to give you the flash drive, and we're going to walk away. And the copies? There are no copies. Your people took the hardware. The data's contained. The lie sat between them like a loaded gun. Coulter held Mercer's gaze without blinking. Somewhere on a frozen highway heading south, Harlan was riding toward Philadelphia with the 3rd copy encrypted on a drive taped inside the lining of his boot, and every second that passed on this pier was a second Harlan gained on the road. Buy time. That was the mission. Buy time and get Ivy out. Mercer studied Coulter's face the way a man studies a poker hand, looking for the tell, the twitch, the involuntary signal that separates truth from performance. Coulter gave him nothing. Years of interrogation resistance training, years of staring into faces that wanted to break him. His expression was concrete. His eyes were stone. Let the girl go, Coulter repeated. Clock's ticking, Mercer. Sun's coming up. And the longer we stand out here with guns drawn, the higher the chance somebody driving to work sees something they shouldn't. Mercer's jaw worked. A muscle in his temple pulsed. The calculation was visible. Cost versus risk, containment versus escalation, the cold mathematics of a man who had spent his entire career making problems disappear and was now facing one that refused to vanish. He looked down at Ivy. The girl stared back at him with those brown eyes, steady, burning, ancient, and in that look there was something Mercer hadn't expected. Not hatred, not pleading. Recognition. The look of a child who had seen the monster behind the mask every single day for 3 years and had never once been fooled. Mercer released her hand. Ivy didn't run. She walked. Steady, deliberate, barefoot, in Ghost's oversized boots, across the frozen concrete toward Coulter Vane. Each step echoed in the silence. Each step was a countdown. Every armed man on the pier watched her move, and not one of them breathed. She reached Coulter. He put his hand on her shoulder. It was shaking. His hand. Not hers. Get on the bike, he whispered. Deck's bike, go. What about you? Go, Ivy. She looked up at him. Her eyes searched his face the way they had in the diner, measuring, deciding, weighing a promise against everything the world had taught her about broken ones. Then she turned and walked to Deck's Harley. Deck reached down with one arm and lifted her onto the seat behind him without taking the Mossberg off target. The girl wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against the back of his cut, and Deck's jaw tightened so hard the muscles stood out like ropes. My men, Coulter said. Mercer spoke into a radio. 30 seconds. A minute. The warehouse doors opened and 2 of Mercer's men walked out flanking Ghost, Reno, and Wren. Ghost was bleeding from a cut above his left eye and walking with a limp that favored his right side. Cracked ribs, probably, from the way he held his arm across his midsection. Reno's face was swollen on the left side and his wrist was taped with what looked like a strip of torn fabric. Wren was pale and shaking but intact, clutching his right hand against his chest. two fingers bent at angles that fingers shouldn't bend. They walked out into the floodlight, blinking, breathing hard, their breath turning white in the freezing air. And when Ghost saw Ivy on the back of Deck's bike, something collapsed in his face. Relief so raw and total that it looked like pain. "Move to the bikes," Coulter said. "All of you. Now." Ghost, Reno, and Wren moved. Slow, hurting, but moving. Boone pulled his Harley forward and Reno climbed on behind him. Ghost took 3 painful steps toward Deck's bike before Coulter stopped him. "Take Wren, Boone's bike." "Coulter, move, Ghost." Ghost moved. He helped Wren onto the back of Boone's Harley and then climbed onto the seat behind Reno on Deck's, 3 bodies crammed onto a machine built for 2. And it didn't matter because they were alive and they were moving, and that was all that counted. Coulter stood alone on the pier. He held up the flash drive. "Come get it," he said. Mercer gestured. One of his men, a tall operative in tactical gear with a face that had never been designed for expression, walked forward and took the drive from Coulter's hand. He brought it back to Mercer, who inserted it into a small tablet device he produced from his coat pocket. His fingers worked the screen. His eyes scanned data. The seconds stretched. Then Mercer nodded. "This appears to be the original." He looked up at Coulter. "You're either a very stupid man or a very honest one." "Can't be both." Mercer almost laughed. Almost. The sound that came out was something drier and colder. "You should know, Mr. Vane, that this changes nothing for you personally. You've seen too much. Your club has seen too much. Regardless of what happens with this drive, there will be consequences." "There always are." "You accept that?" "I've been accepting consequences since I was 19 years old and a recruiter promised me I'd see the world." Coulter's eyes didn't waver. "I've accepted consequences you can't even imagine, Mercer, so if you're trying to scare me, you should know the scary part of my life happened a long time ago. Everything since then is just noise." Mercer stared at him. For the first time, the mask slipped. Just a millimeter, just for a heartbeat. And beneath it, Coulter saw something unexpected. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to confusion. The bewilderment of a man who had spent his entire life understanding what motivated people. Money, fear, ambition, self-preservation. Encountering someone who didn't fit any of the categories. "Go," Mercer said. "Take your men, take the girl, and understand that this conversation is not over." Coulter turned his back on Wade Mercer and 12 armed men and walked to his motorcycle. Every step was a bet. Every second was a window in which a bullet could enter the back of his skull and end everything. He felt the weight of those 12 weapons like heat on his spine, like the sun focused through glass, and he didn't walk faster, and he didn't look back because looking back meant fear. And fear was a door he'd welded shut years ago. He reached the Harley. He mounted it. He kicked the engine to life, and the sound, that deep, thundering, full-throated roar, filled the pier and rolled across the frozen river and echoed off the warehouse walls like the voice of something ancient and unbreakable. "Ride," he said. 4 Harleys peeled off the pier in formation. Deck with Ivy in the lead, Boone with Reno and Wren behind him, Ghost sandwiched in the middle, Coulter bringing up the rear with his eyes on the mirrors and his heart slamming against his ribs, like a prisoner trying to break through a wall. They hit the access road at 50, then the main street at 70, blowing through dead intersections and past dark houses, and out of Blackwater Ridge with the sun cracking the horizon behind them like an egg spilling gold across the frozen mountains. Nobody followed, not immediately. Mercer let them go because he believed the data was contained. He believed the flash drive in his hand was the last copy. He believed 3 broken bikers and a 10-year-old girl were a problem he could address later, at his leisure, through the mechanisms he had always used: money, influence, the quiet machinery of power that operated in the spaces between what people knew and what they were allowed to know. He was wrong, and by the time he realized it, it would be too late. They rode for 45 minutes before Coulter called a stop at a rest area off Route 6, a concrete shelter with 2 picnic tables and a water fountain that had been shut off for winter. The parking lot was empty. The trees were bare. The sun was up, but the light was thin and cold, the kind of light that illuminates without warming, that shows you everything but comforts nothing. Ghost half fell off the back of the bike and sat down hard on the frozen ground with his arms wrapped around his ribs and his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Wren collapsed onto a picnic table bench and cradled his broken fingers against his chest, his face gray. Reno leaned against a tree and closed his eyes and didn't move. Ivy climbed off Deck's bike and stood in the parking lot, looking at the damaged men around her. Her face was quiet, composed, but her hands were clenched at her sides and her shoulders were pulled tight, and when she spoke, her voice was smaller than it had been at any point since the diner. "This is because of me," she said. Coulter was checking Ghost's ribs, pressing gently along the left side, feeling for breaks, watching Ghost's face for the involuntary wince that would indicate a fracture. He stopped. He looked at Ivy. "No," he said. "They got hurt because of me. Ghost's ribs, Wren's fingers, Patch." Her voice cracked on the name. "All of it. Because I took the drive. Because I ran." Coulter straightened. His knees popped. His back screamed. He was running on no sleep, no food, and a caffeine deficit that was starting to make the edges of his vision swim. He walked to Ivy and knelt in front of her, his hands on her shoulders, his face level with hers. "Listen to me," he said. "You didn't do this. Mercer did this. He did it when he built a criminal empire in a town full of people who trusted him. He did it when he hurt people who couldn't fight back. And he did it every night you lay in your bed listening through the floor to things no child should ever have to hear. None of this is on you, Ivy. None of it. But if you hadn't taken that drive and walked into that diner, the people Mercer is hurting would still be invisible. They'd still be trapped. They'd still be moved through buildings in the middle of the night like they were cargo instead of human beings. You didn't cause this, Ivy. You lit the match that's going to burn it down." The girl stared at him. Her chin trembled once. Her eyes filled. And then, for the first time since she had stumbled barefoot into Ricky's diner with blood on her sleeve and terror in her bones, Ivy Mercer cried. She cried the way children cry when the dam finally breaks. Not quietly, not delicately, but with her whole body, great heaving sobs that shook her frame and made sounds that were older than language. She cried into Coulter's shoulder while he held her, his scarred hands on her back, his face pressed against the top of her head, and he felt every sob like a punch to the center of his chest, because the last time he had held a child who cried like this, the child was his daughter, and she had been crying because she was afraid to die, and he hadn't been able to stop it then, and the echo of that failure had lived inside him ever since like a splinter in the heart that no amount of time or distance or whiskey could dissolve. But this child was alive. This child was here. And this child had just cried harder than he had ever heard another human being cry. And when she finally stopped, when the sobs slowed and then quieted and then faded into the shaky, hiccuping breathing that follows grief's worst waves, she pulled back and looked at him and said 4 words that broke him open in a place he thought was beyond breaking. "Don't let me go." Coulter held her gaze. His eyes were wet. He didn't hide it. He didn't look away. "Never," he said. Deck watched from the bike. His face was unreadable, but his hand, the one that wasn't holding the Mossberg, was trembling. And when Boone caught his eye, the big man shook his head once, slowly, the gesture of a soldier who has seen many things but still finds himself unequipped for the weight of a child's tears. Ghost, sitting on the ground with cracked ribs and a cut above his eye, watched Ivy cry into Coulter's shoulder and thought about a field hospital in Syria where a boy no older than her had been brought in with shrapnel in his abdomen and had looked up at Ghost with the same expression, not asking to be saved, just asking to not be alone. And Ghost had held that boy's hand until the medevac arrived, and then had never found out if he lived or died. The not knowing had haunted him. It still did. It was one of the reasons he'd started using. It was one of the reasons he'd stopped. He got to his feet, slowly, painfully. Every breath was a knife. But he was standing. "Coulter," Ghost said. "Patch is still in there." The name fell into the group like cold water. Every head turned. "I know," Coulter said. He released Ivy gently, stood, and faced his men. "Mercer released us because he thinks he's won. He thinks the data is gone. He doesn't know about Harlan. Right now, Harlan is—" He checked his watch. "Maybe an hour from Philadelphia. If the roads are clear, he reaches Drummond by 8. If Drummond moves fast, federal warrants could be issued by noon. And Patch? Patch is alive because Mercer needs insurance. As long as Mercer thinks there's a possibility we might talk, Patch stays alive. The moment federal agents show up at his door, Mercer's leverage disappears and Patch becomes He stopped. He couldn't say the word. He didn't need to. Every man there finished the sentence in his head. So we get Patch before the feds move, Deck said. We get Patch before the feds move. How? We just walked off that pier. They let us go. If we roll back in there, the deal's off and they kill us all. We don't roll back in. We don't go near the waterfront. Coulter pulled out the burner phone. Wren, can you still work? Wren looked up from the bench. His face was the color of ash. His broken fingers were swollen to twice their normal size. But his other hand, his left, was steady, and his eyes, behind the pain, were sharp. Depends what you need, Wren said. The satellite photos from the flash drive data, the construction site layouts. Before they took the hardware, did you upload any of it? Wren's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile on a man in too much pain to commit to the full expression. I uploaded everything to an encrypted cloud server before they kicked in the door. The drives they took were copies of copies. The data is already in 3 different countries. Dex stared at him. You're telling me you backed it up remotely? I'm telling you I'm a paranoid man with a background in military communications who assumed from the moment I walked into that cabin that someone was going to try to take the hardware. Wren shifted his broken hand and winced. They got the laptops. They got the local copies. They did not get the server. And the server has everything, including GPS metadata from Mercer's shipping manifests that pinpoint exactly which construction sites were used and when. Can you access the server from a phone? From a phone, a tablet, a smart refrigerator, anything with a browser and a connection. Coulter handed him the burner. Find Patch. Cross-reference the site layouts with the photo they sent, the I-beam spacing, the fluorescent fixtures, everything you identified earlier. Narrow it down. Wren took the phone. His left hand moved across the small screen with a speed that seemed impossible for a man with 2 freshly broken fingers on his other hand. But Wren had spent years typing with one hand while eating with the other in windowless server rooms, and pain was just another input to be managed. 4 minutes. That was all it took. 4 minutes of silence while the sun climbed and the frost began to melt on the picnic tables, and Ivy sat on the ground beside Ghost, who was teaching her a breathing exercise he'd learned in recovery. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out. And the girl followed along with a focus that was almost meditative. 2 damaged people sitting on frozen concrete sharing the one thing they had in common. The knowledge of how to survive when surviving was the hardest thing in the world. Got it, Wren said. Every head turned. The steel fabrication plant on Route 6. Building C. The unfinished wing. The I-beam spacing matches exactly. The fixture type matches. And according to the shipping manifests, Building C was the last site used for transit operations 3 weeks ago. It's the most recent, the most equipped, and the most isolated. That's where he is. How far? Coulter asked. 12 miles north. Security? Unknown. But if Mercer just pulled his main force to the waterfront for our exchange, Building C might be running a skeleton crew. 2, maybe 3 men watching Patch. Or it's a trap, Boone said. Or it's a trap, Coulter agreed. But Patch doesn't have the luxury of certainty. He has, maybe hours. If we wait for the feds, we wait too long. Boone looked at the sky. The sun was a pale disk behind thin clouds, casting no warmth, offering no reassurance. I'm coming with you. Your bike's carrying 3. Drop Reno and Wren here. Ghost stays with Ivy. You, me, Deck. 3 men, 12 miles. We go in, we get the kid, we get out. Coulter looked at Deck. The big man was already off his bike, handing Ivy to Ghost with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his size and the weapon in his hands. I'm in, Deck said. That kid brought me a birthday cake, Coulter. In a snowstorm. Nobody told him to. He just did it because he's that kind of person. His voice dropped. We don't leave that kind of person in a room. 3 Harleys, 3 men, 12 miles. They left Wren, Reno, Ghost, and Ivy at the rest area with the burner phone, a 45, and instructions to move to the next town if they didn't hear from Coulter by 8:12 a.m. Ghost stood in the parking lot with Ivy beside him, watching the 3 bikes pull onto the highway, and the last thing Coulter saw in his mirror was the girl, small, still, standing in the thin winter sunlight with one hand raised, not waving, just held up flat against the morning air, like she was pressing her palm against a window that separated her world from his. The steel fabrication plant sat in a cleared area of forest off a dirt access road that branched from Route 6 like a broken rib. 3 buildings, A, B, and C, arranged in an L shape around a concrete yard. Buildings A and B were partially completed, their steel frames wrapped in weather sheeting that popped and cracked in the wind. Building C was the furthest from the road, set back against the tree line, its walls fully enclosed with corrugated steel, its windows blacked out, its loading bay doors closed. One vehicle sat in the yard, a single black SUV, engine off. No visible occupants. Coulter, Deck, and Boone sat on their bikes at the edge of the tree line, engines idling low, watching. One vehicle, Boone said. Could mean 2 men inside, could mean 10. Could mean the vehicle's a decoy and they're waiting in the trees, Deck added. We don't have time to surveil, Coulter said. Boone, you take the yard. Keep eyes on the SUV and the access road. Anyone comes, anyone leaves, you let us know. Deck, you take the loading bay. I go through the side entrance. Coulter, if there's more than 3, then we adapt. We've been adapting all night. One more time won't kill us. It literally might. Then it does. They moved. Boone peeled off and circled wide to position himself behind a stack of concrete barriers at the yard's perimeter. Deck rode straight to the loading bay, killed his engine 30 yards out, and dismounted with the Mossberg at port arms, his prosthetic clicking against the frozen dirt as he advanced in a crouch that would have been textbook in any military training manual. Coulter took the long way around, following the tree line until he reached the side of Building C, where a rusted steel door hung slightly ajar on broken hinges. He drew the .45 from his waistband. The grip was cold. His hands were stiff. He pressed his back against the corrugated wall and listened. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights. The low murmur of a radio playing country music, tinny and distant. The occasional shuffle of on concrete. And beneath all of it, another sound. A sound that tightened Coulter's stomach into a fist. Breathing, labored, wet. The breathing of someone in significant pain trying very hard not to make noise. Patch. Coulter pushed the door open with his shoulder. It swung inward on screaming hinges, and the sound echoed through the building like a shout. He stepped inside. The space was vast. A high-ceilinged industrial bay with concrete floors and exposed steel I-beams running across the ceiling at 20-foot intervals. Crates lined the walls. A forklift sat dead in the corner. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that flat, sterile white that makes shadows disappear and replaces them with a kind of clinical clarity that shows you exactly what you're looking at without allowing you to look away. Patch was in the center of the bay. I was hanging from his wrists by a chain looped over an I-beam, his feet barely touching the floor, his body swaying slightly with each ragged breath. His shirt was gone. His torso was a map of bruises, deep purple, angry red, the sick yellow of older damage that predated tonight. His head hung forward, his eyes were swollen shut. Blood had dried in dark streaks from his nose to his chin to his chest, and fresh blood was still seeping from a wound on his right side that looked like it had been made with something sharp and deliberate. 2 men stood near him. One was leaning against a crate checking his phone. The other was sitting in a folding chair with a baton across his knees and a cup of coffee in his hand, watching Patch with the bored expression of someone performing a job they found tedious. Neither of them was expecting company. Coulter raised the .45. Put it down, he said. Both of you. On the floor. Now. The man with the phone looked up. His eyes went wide. His hand moved toward his hip. Coulter adjusted his aim 2 degrees. Your hand reaches that weapon. I put a hole in your shoulder. You'll live. But you'll wish you hadn't. Down. Now. The man with the baton stood slowly from the chair. He was big, taller than Coulter, broader, and his eyes had the flat, practiced calm of someone who had hurt people professionally for a long time and had learned to treat violence like plumbing, a job, a process. Pipes and pressure. You're the biker, the man said. Vane. Down. Mercer said you'd come. He said you wouldn't be able to leave the kid. The loading bay door behind them exploded inward. Deck came through it like a wall of fury. 300 pounds of muscle and titanium and rage, the Mossberg leveled, his voice filling the building with a sound that was closer to thunder than language. On the ground, now! The man with the phone dropped. Face first, hands behind his head, phone skittering across the concrete. The man with the baton hesitated. 1 second, 2 seconds, the hesitation of a professional calculating whether he could reach Coulter before Deck reached him. He couldn't. He knew it. He put the baton down and lowered himself to the floor. Coulter crossed the room in 5 strides and reached for Patch. The boy was barely conscious. His swollen eyes opened a crack, one thin line of white, and a sound came from his broken lips that was almost a word. I'm here, kid. I'm here. We're getting you down. Deck covered the 2 men on the floor while Coulter worked the chain. It was a heavy industrial chain looped through a padlock on the I-beam. No key visible. Coulter looked around, spotted a bolt cutter on the workbench near the wall, and grabbed it. 3 cuts. The chain fell. Patch crumbled. Coulter caught him. 200 pounds of broken, bleeding, 22-year-old kid collapsed into Coulter's arms, and the weight of him, physical and otherwise, drove Coulter to one knee. He held Patch against his chest, one hand behind the kid's head, the other pressed against the wound on his side to slow the bleeding, and he said the only thing he could say. "You're out. It's over. You're with us now." Patch's hand found Coulter's forearm and gripped it, weak, trembling. But there. "Didn't tell them anything," Patch whispered. "They asked about the girl, about the drive. I know you didn't. Hurt. Real bad, Coulter. I know, kid. Ghost is waiting. He's going to fix you up. Just hold on." Boone's voice crackled through the silence, shouting from outside. "Coulter, we got movement. 2 vehicles coming up the access road. Fast. 60 seconds. Coulter looked at Deck. Deck looked at Patch. Patch could barely stand. He couldn't ride. He couldn't run. 60 seconds. "The loading bay," Coulter said. "Deck, get the bikes. Bring them inside. We go through the back." "There is no back exit, Coulter. I checked. This building's sealed on 3 sides. 45 seconds. The sound of engines growing louder on the access road, tires grinding on frozen gravel, the rising pitch of vehicles pushing hard toward a destination they intended to reach. Coulter stood in the center of a concrete bay holding a broken boy in his arms with 2 enemies on the floor, and 2 more vehicles closing fast and no exit and no time and no plan. His .45 had 7 rounds. Deck's Mossberg held 5. Boone was outside with a pistol and 3 bikes in an access road that was about to become a kill zone. He looked down at Patch. The kid's eyes were open, barely, painfully, and in them Coulter saw something that went beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond the physical wreckage of a body that had been systematically broken. He saw trust, the same trust he'd seen in Ivy's eyes at the diner, the same trust he'd seen in his daughter's eyes in the hospital room 10 years ago, when she'd asked him if everything was going to be okay, and he'd said yes because what else could a father say? 30 seconds. And then his phone buzzed. Harlan's number. 1 word on the screen. Drummond. Harlan had made it. The data was delivered. Annalise Drummond had the flash drive, the names, the dates, the badge numbers, every piece of evidence that Wren had pulled from the darkness of Mercer's encrypted files. It was done. The bomb was lit. The fuse was burning. And somewhere in Philadelphia, a federal prosecutor was reading data that would end Wade Mercer's empire. But that was Philadelphia. And this was a concrete building on Route 6 with 2 vehicles screaming up the access road and a boy bleeding in Coulter's arms, and 15 seconds left before the world narrowed to the space between a trigger and a prayer. Coulter set Patch down gently against the wall. He stood. He checked the .45. 7 rounds. He looked at Deck. "Make them count," Coulter said. Outside, the vehicles hit the yard, doors opened, boots hit the ground. Commands were shouted in clipped professional voices, and the sound of weapons being readied echoed between the buildings like a countdown reaching 0. Deck racked the Mossberg one final time. The sound rang through Building C. Sharp, metallic, absolute. And in the silence that followed, Coulter Vane took a breath, raised his weapon, and turned toward the loading bay door as the first shadows appeared in the light. The first shadow through the loading bay door belonged to a man Coulter didn't recognize. Tactical vest, short-barreled rifle, the confident stride of someone who had cleared buildings before and expected this one to be no different. Coulter fired once. The round hit the concrete wall 6 inches from the man's head. Intentional, a warning shot that sent chips of concrete spraying across his face and drove him backward into the men behind him. Not a kill shot. Coulter wasn't a killer. He was a wall. And walls don't advance. They hold. "Back off!" Deck's voice shook the building. The Mossberg boomed. One deafening blast aimed at the ceiling above the loading bay, bringing down a shower of rust and insulation that filled the doorway with debris and dust and chaos. The men outside scattered, boots on gravel, shouted commands, the sound of vehicles repositioning. Coulter pressed his back against a steel support column and checked on Patch. The kid was conscious, barely, propped against the wall with his hand pressed to the wound on his side, his lips moving in a whisper that might have been counting or might have been something else entirely. His eyes tracked Coulter through the swelling. He was still here, still fighting, still the kid who drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to bring a birthday cake to a man he barely knew. "Deck," Coulter said. "How many?" "6, maybe 8. 2 vehicles. They're fanning out around the building." "Windows?" "Blacked out. They can't see in, but they know we're cornered." Another voice from outside, amplified, projected through a bullhorn that gave it a tinny, mechanical edge. "This is Detective Gareth Nolan, Blackwater Ridge Police Department. You are surrounded. Put down your weapons and exit the building with your hands raised." Nolan, the same man who had stood at the fence of Leland Steelworks 12 hours ago with his badge on a lanyard and Mercer's champagne still on his breath. The system, dressed in a badge, asking wolves to surrender. Coulter laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was the sound of a man who had been running for 20 hours on no sleep and cold coffee and the kind of adrenaline that burns through your body like diesel through an engine, leaving nothing behind but heat and fumes and the grim certainty that the machine can't run much longer. "Nolan," Coulter called back. His voice echoed off the concrete walls. "You're about 4 hours from being arrested yourself. Your name is on a flash drive that's sitting on a federal prosecutor's desk in Philadelphia right now. Your badge number, your payment records, every dollar Wade Mercer ever put in your pocket. So if I were you, I'd be thinking very carefully about what side of this door you want to be standing on when the FBI gets here." Silence from outside. Long, uncertain silence. The kind that happens when a man who thought he was holding all the cards suddenly realizes the deck has been switched. Coulter's phone buzzed. A text from Boone, who was still outside behind the concrete barriers. "Nolan's on the phone. Looks rattled. 2 of his guys are arguing. Good. Fractures. When the structure starts to crack, the pieces that fall first are the ones with the least to gain and the most to lose. Nolan's men weren't Mercer's private operators. They were cops. Dirty cops. Compromised cops. Cops who had traded their oaths for paydays. But still cops. Men with families and pensions and the knowledge that federal indictments don't come with severance packages." Another text from Boone, 30 seconds later. "1 vehicle leaving. 4 men, heading south. Nolan's down to 4. The math was changing. Coulter looked at Deck. The big man was crouched behind a stack of crates near the loading bay, the Mossberg trained on the door, his breathing controlled and even. The breathing of a man who had done this before in places hotter and louder and infinitely more dangerous than a construction site in rural Pennsylvania. His prosthetic leg was braced against the concrete floor at an angle that would allow him to pivot and fire in any direction within a 1-second window. Muscle memory. The body remembering what the mind tried to forget. "They're breaking," Coulter said. "Not fast enough." "Give it time." "We don't have time. Patch is bleeding." Coulter looked at the kid. The wound on his side was still seeping, dark, steady, the slow bleed of something deep that needed more than pressure and willpower. Ghost could fix it. Ghost had the hands and the training and the 14 months of sobriety that kept those hands steady. But Ghost was miles away at a rest area with a 10-year-old girl and a 45 and no idea what was happening inside Building C. "Nolan!" Coulter shouted. "I've got an injured man in here, 22 years old. He needs medical attention. You let us walk out with him. Nobody fires a shot. Nobody gets charged with obstruction. You've still got a window, Nolan. It's closing, but it's still there." More silence. Then Nolan's voice, this time without the bullhorn. Closer. Rawer. The voice of a man whose professional composure was crumbling like wet drywall. "Vane, you're bluffing. There's no flash drive. There's no prosecutor." Annalise Drummond, Department of Justice, Philadelphia Field Office. She prosecuted military contractors in Afghanistan, and she's reading your payment history right now. You want me to give you her direct number so you can call her yourself? Nothing. Absolute nothing. The wind blew. Snow drifted through the shattered remains of the loading bay door. Somewhere inside the building, a fluorescent light buzzed and flickered, its ballast dying. Coulter's phone buzzed again. Not Boone this time. An unknown number. He looked at the screen. The message was from Annalise Drummond. Harlan Briggs delivered the drive. Data confirmed. Federal warrants issued for Wade Mercer and 11 law enforcement officers in Blackwater Ridge. FBI tactical teams en route. ETA to Blackwater Ridge, 90 minutes. Hold your position if safe to do so. A. Drummond Coulter read the message twice. Then he turned the phone so Deck could see it. Deck read it. His face didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A release, microscopic, like a bridge cable losing 1 degree of tension. Not relaxation, not relief. Something closer to the moment a soldier realizes the reinforcements are real and the horizon isn't empty anymore. 90 minutes, Deck said. 90 minutes. Patch doesn't have 90 minutes. Coulter looked at the kid. Patch's face was gray now. His breathing was shallower. His hand on the wound had gone slack, the fingers loosening, the pressure fading. The blood was darker than it had been. Venous, slow, the kind of bleed that doesn't kill you fast but kills you certainly. The way a river erodes a bank 1 grain at a time until the whole thing collapses. Coulter stood up. He put the .45 on the ground. He raised his hands. Coulter, Deck started. Cover me. Don't shoot unless they shoot. He walked toward the loading bay door. Hands up. Empty. Visible. His boots echoed on the concrete with each step. His shadow stretched long behind him in the fluorescent light, and it looked, from a certain angle, like the shadow of a man walking toward something he couldn't see the other side of. He stepped through the shattered door into the dawn. The light hit him like cold water. The sun was up, weak and white, casting thin shadows across the yard. 4 men stood near the remaining SUV. Nolan in front, 3 others behind him, all armed, all watching. Coulter emerged from the building with his hands raised and nothing in them but calloused palms and engine grease. Nolan, Coulter said, look at me. The detective looked. His face was different than it had been at the fence. The professional polish was gone. What remained was the face of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down, calculating the fall. I'm not armed, Coulter said. My man inside has a shotgun, and he will use it if you give him a reason. But I'm standing here with nothing because I need you to hear what I'm about to say without the noise. Talk. In 90 minutes, FBI tactical teams will be in Blackwater Ridge. They have warrants for Wade Mercer. They have warrants for 11 officers. Your name is on that list, Nolan. I've seen it. Your badge number, your bank records, every payment Mercer made to you for the past 3 years. It's over. The question isn't whether you go down. You're going down. The question is how far. Nolan's throat moved. A swallow. Involuntary. Right now, in that building, there's a 22-year-old kid who was kidnapped and tortured by Mercer's people. He's bleeding. He needs a hospital. If he dies in there because you kept us pinned down to protect a man who's already finished, that's felony murder. On top of everything else. On top of the trafficking, the corruption, the conspiracy. Felony murder, Nolan. That's the rest of your life. Nolan's hand was on his weapon. His knuckles were white. Behind him, his 3 remaining men were exchanging glances. The rapid, shifting eye contact of people who are silently negotiating their own survival. Or, Coulter said, you let us walk out. You let us take the kid to a hospital. And when the FBI arrives, you cooperate. You testify. You give them Mercer and everyone connected to him. It won't save you from prison, but it might save you from dying in one. The wind blew. Snow crystals skittered across the concrete between them like tiny ghosts. The fluorescent light in Building C flickered and hummed. Somewhere on Route 6, a truck rumbled past, oblivious. Its driver headed somewhere warm with a radio playing and coffee in the cup holder, and not a single idea that 50 yards from the highway, a man's entire future was balanced on a decision he had 3 seconds to make. Nolan's hand came off his weapon. Go, he said. The word was barely audible. A whisper pushed through clenched teeth, the sound of a man surrendering not to an enemy but to a reality he could no longer outrun. Take the kid. Go. Coulter didn't hesitate. He turned and walked back into Building C. Deck had Patch on his feet, or what passed for his feet. The kid's arm draped over Deck's massive shoulders, his body sagging, his head lolling, but his eyes open. Still open. Still there. They walked out of Building C together. Coulter on one side, Deck on the other, Patch between them, his bare feet dragging across the frozen ground, leaving thin trails of blood on the concrete that the snow would cover within the hour. Boone pulled up on his Harley, and they lifted Patch onto the back, wedged between Boone and the sissy bar, held in place by gravity and desperation, and Boone's left arm hooked backward around the kid's waist. Nolan watched them go. His men watched them go. Nobody raised a weapon. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the engines. 3 Harleys firing in the cold, their exhaust plumes rising into the dawn like smoke signals from a war that was finally ending. They rode. 12 miles to the rest area where Ghost was waiting. They made it in 9 minutes, running every light, taking every curve too fast. The frozen road a blur beneath tires that had no business maintaining traction, but did anyway because the machines were as stubborn as the men who rode them. Ghost saw them coming. I was standing in his parking lot with Ivy beside him, his cracked ribs taped with strips torn from his own shirt, his medical kit open on the picnic table, already prepared, already waiting, because a combat medic never stops preparing for the casualty he hopes will never come. Patch was unconscious by the time they lifted him off the bike. Ghost went to work immediately. Steady hands, sharp eyes, the focus of a man channeling every ounce of his training into the space between life and death. He packed the wound on Patch's side with hemostatic gauze from his kit, applied pressure, started an IV line from a saline bag he'd kept in his pack since Syria because old habits don't die. They just wait for the moment they're needed again. Hospital, Ghost said without looking up. Now, this is beyond field medicine. Nearest ER is Ridgemont General, Wren said from the bench where he sat cradling his broken fingers. 22 miles east. Call ahead, Coulter said. Tell them we're coming. Stab wound, significant blood loss, possible internal damage. Boone made the call. They loaded Patch into the most stable configuration they could manage, on the back of Deck's Harley, held in place by a system of bungee cords and leather straps, and Deck's iron arm, the big man riding slower than he'd ever ridden in his life. Every bump in the road a potential disaster, every mile a negotiation between speed and survival. They made it. 22 miles in 31 minutes, pulling into the ambulance bay at Ridgemont General with Patch's blood on their leather and their hands and the chrome of their machines. Nurses came running. A gurney appeared. Patch was lifted, transferred, wheeled through double doors that swung shut behind him, and then he was gone, into the bright white world of surgery and medicine and the kind of saving that required tools more precise than loyalty and hands more sterile than a biker's. Coulter stood in the ambulance bay and watched the doors. His arms hung at his sides. His face was blank. The adrenaline had drained out of him somewhere on Route 6, leaving behind a hollow so vast and deep that he felt like a building with its foundation removed, still standing, but only because nothing had pushed him yet. Ivy appeared beside him. She didn't speak. She just stood there, a 10-year-old girl in an oversized jacket and boots 4 sizes too big, standing next to a man twice her height with blood on his hands, and she reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers. Small. Warm. Alive. They stood there like that for a long time, watching the hospital doors, listening to the distant wail of another ambulance somewhere on the highway, feeling the weak winter sun on their faces, and the cold air in their lungs, and the slow, gradual, agonizing return of something that neither of them had felt in a very long time, and that neither of them had a name for yet. The FBI arrived in Blackwater Ridge at 9:47 that morning. Coulter learned the details later, in pieces, from Drummond's office, from news reports that trickled out over the following weeks, from Harlan, who had ridden back from Philadelphia with dark circles under his eyes, and a quiet pride in his voice that he would never fully express. Federal agents executed simultaneous warrants at Wade Mercer's residence, his corporate offices, and 4 construction sites. Mercer was arrested at his home at 10:02 a.m. while eating breakfast. He was wearing a cashmere robe and Italian slippers, and he did not resist. His lawyer arrived within the hour. It didn't matter. The data on the flash drive was comprehensive, meticulously organized, and corroborated by a paper trail that stretched across 3 states and 2 countries. Annalise Drummond, who had spent her career prosecuting men who hid their crimes behind contracts and handshakes, called it the most complete corruption file she had ever seen. 11 officers were arrested over the following 48 hours. Gareth Nolan turned himself in at 3 p.m. on the day of the raids. accompanied by his own lawyer and a written statement that took federal prosecutors 6 hours to read. He cooperated fully. It would not save him from prison, but it would save him from the worst of it, and perhaps that was the most a man in his position could hope for. The trafficking network was dismantled piece by piece. 14 shell companies were frozen. $47 million in assets were seized. 23 victims were identified and connected with federal services. Some of them were women who had been missing for years. Some were children. Their names were not released to the public, but Coulter learned from Drummond that one of them, a 14-year-old girl from Guatemala, had been held in the basement of a construction site less than 2 miles from Blackwater Ridge's town hall for 9 months. 9 months. In the basement. 2 miles from where people bought groceries and dropped their kids off at school and complained about property taxes. Coulter received that information while standing in the hospital hallway outside Patch's room, and he leaned against the wall and pressed his forehead against the cold plaster and closed his eyes and breathed through the rage, the way he'd breathed through everything else in his life. Slowly, deliberately, the 4-count rhythm that Ghost had taught Ivy in a frozen parking lot a lifetime ago. Patch survived. The surgery took 4 hours. 3 cracked ribs, a lacerated kidney, a deep tissue wound that required 62 stitches, and a concussion that kept him in observation for a week. When he woke up, the first thing he saw was Deck, sitting in the chair beside his bed, the Mossberg nowhere in sight, a paperback novel open on his knee that he wasn't reading. "Hey, kid," Deck said. Patch blinked. His swollen eyes took in the hospital room, the machines, the IV, the fluorescent lights, the massive man sitting beside him, like a sentinel carved from granite. "Did we win?" Patch whispered. Deck looked at him for a long time. Then his face did something that very few people in the world had ever seen it do. He smiled. "Yeah, kid, we won." The weeks that followed were quieter than anything the Iron Saints had known in years. The garage beneath Leland Steel Works was gone. Mercer's men had burned it the night they took Patch, and nothing remained but scorched concrete and twisted metal, and the ghost of the mural Reno had spent 3 months painting. The loss hurt in ways that surprised them. Not the building itself. Buildings are just walls and roofs and the illusion of permanence. What hurt was the space. The place where they had gathered, where they had existed together, where the sound of engines and the smell of coffee and the silence between brothers had created something that felt, in its rough and imperfect way, like home. Boone found a new location within 2 weeks, a decommissioned fire station on the east side of Blackwater Ridge, red brick, tall bay doors, a second floor with windows that overlooked the mountains. The town council approved the lease at a public meeting that drew standing room crowds, because by then the Iron Saints were no longer the bikers people crossed the street to avoid. They were the men who had sheltered a child and exposed a monster, and Blackwater Ridge, the town that had slept with its eyes closed while Wade Mercer built an empire in the dark, was slowly, painfully learning to see. The Saints rebuilt. Deck welded new workbenches. Harlan mounted new security cameras. Boone set up the coffee station, the same ancient percolator, the same bottom-of-the-pot sludge that tasted like motor oil and nostalgia. Ghost organized a medical corner, properly stocked this time, with supplies donated by the Ridgemont General ER staff, who had treated Patch, and who had heard, through the quiet networks that connect people who save lives, what the Iron Saints had done, and why. Reno started a new mural on the back wall of the fire station. He worked on it at night, alone, in the light of a single shop lamp, and he didn't let anyone see it until it was finished. When he finally pulled the drop cloth away, the room went silent. It showed a road, a long, straight highway cutting through mountains under a winter sky. On the road, 7 motorcycles rode in formation, and on the back of the lead bike, barely visible, a small figure held on with both arms, face tucked against the rider's back, hair streaming in the wind. Nobody said anything. Reno shrugged and went back to cleaning his brushes. That was Reno, the man who said everything with his hands and nothing with his mouth. Ivy's situation took longer to resolve. Child Protective Services opened a case within hours of Mercer's arrest. Ivy's mother, Claire Mercer, collapsed when FBI agents explained what her husband had been doing. She was taken to the hospital for observation. She did not eat for 3 days. When she finally spoke, the only thing she said was Ivy's name. Claire Mercer was not charged with any crime. The investigation determined that she had been unaware of her husband's activities. a finding that Ivy had already delivered months earlier in a cabin in the woods, when she said, with the flat certainty of a child who had carried an impossible secret for 3 years, "She thinks he's a good man." Ivy was placed in temporary foster care while Claire recovered. The placement lasted 11 days. On the 12th day, a family court judge reviewed the case and granted temporary custody to Claire, who had moved into a small apartment above a bakery on Blackwater Ridge's Main Street and had started, slowly and painfully, to rebuild a life that didn't include the man she had loved and the monster he had been. But every Saturday morning, a motorcycle pulled up in front of the bakery. The engine rumbled once, then went quiet, and Ivy came down the stairs with her backpack and her notebook and her pencils and climbed onto the back of Coulter Vane's Harley and rode with him to the fire station, where she spent the day in the garage surrounded by men in leather and the smell of engine grease and the sound of tools and the quiet understanding that this, too, was family. Not the family she was born into, not the family the law recognized on paper, but the family that had answered when she knocked on a diner door at 2 in the morning with blood on her sleeve and nowhere else to go. Ghost taught her first aid. Deck taught her how to change a tire. Boone showed her how the coffee machine worked and then pretended to be offended when she said his coffee tasted like dirt. Harlan, who hadn't spoken to his own children in 3 years, sat with Ivy at the workbench one afternoon and told her about them. Their names, their ages, the last time he'd seen them, the letters he'd written that were never answered. He didn't know why he told her, but Ivy listened the way she listened to everything, with her whole body, her eyes steady, her hands still. And when he finished, she said, "You should call them." "They don't want to hear from me," Harlan said. "You don't know that. You just know they haven't called you. That's not the same thing." Harlan stared at her. This 10-year-old girl who had survived things that would break most adults, who had carried a dead man's secret in a backpack and walked barefoot through a snowstorm and trusted strangers because the people she was supposed to trust had failed her. This child was telling him to call his sons. He called them that night. His oldest son answered on the 4th ring. The conversation lasted 7 minutes. Most of it was silence. But at the end, his son said, "Don't hang up yet, Dad." And Harlan sat on the porch of the fire station in the cold with the phone pressed to his ear and tears running into his beard and the sound of his son's breathing on the other end of the line, like a signal from a place he'd thought he'd lost the coordinates to. Coulter filed for foster certification 2 months after Mercer's arrest. The process was slow. Background checks, home inspections, psychological evaluations, a mountain of paperwork designed to ensure that the people who cared for vulnerable children were equipped for the weight of it. Coulter filled out every form. He attended every meeting. He opened his life to strangers with clipboards and passed every test they gave him, not because the tests were easy, but because the alternative, the world in which Ivy didn't have him standing beside her, was unacceptable. The certification came through on a Tuesday in March. Coulter was in the garage when he got the call. He hung up the phone and sat on the workbench and stared at the wall for a long time. And Deck, who was the only other person in the room, watched him and said nothing and understood everything. That Saturday, when Ivy came down the stairs above the bakery with her backpack, Coulter was standing beside the Harley with an envelope in his hand. "What's that?" Ivy asked. "A letter from the state. Says I'm certified to be your foster parent, if you want." Ivy looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Coulter. Then she looked at the motorcycle, the leather cut, the scarred hands, the gray eyes that had seen too much and survived it all, and still, somehow, impossibly, against every odd, had room left in them for one more person. "If I want," she repeated. "Your choice, Ivy. Always your choice." She took the envelope. She opened it. She read it with the focus she gave to everything, total, complete, the attention of a child who had learned that the details mattered because the details were where the truth hid. Then she folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and slid it into her backpack next to her notebooks and her pencils and the small collection of motorcycle sketches that had grown from a nervous habit in a freezing diner into something that looked remarkably like art. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "Okay." Coulter nodded. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. He didn't trust his voice to say anything more, so he didn't try. He just handed her the helmet, the one Deck had bought 2 weeks ago and mounted on the sissy bar without telling anyone, the small one, child-sized, matte black with a single silver stripe, and she put it on and climbed onto the back of the Harley and wrapped her arms around his waist. They rode to the fire station. The spring air was cold, but the sun was warm for the first time in months, and the mountains were beginning to show green at their bases, and the road was dry, and the engine sounded the way Harley engines always sound, like something alive and stubborn and unbreakable, like the voice of a machine that refuses to quit because quitting was never part of the design. At the fire station, the bay doors were open. Music played from Boone's radio, old blues, the kind with a slide guitar that sounds like a human voice, trying to say something too big for words. The smell of coffee drifted into the parking lot. Deck was at the workbench, teaching Patch, who had been discharged from the hospital 3 weeks earlier and was moving carefully, but moving, how to true a motorcycle wheel with a spoke wrench. Ghost was restocking the medical corner. Reno was touching up the mural, adding details so small they were invisible from across the room, but perfect up close. Harlan sat on the porch with his phone in his hand, texting his youngest son, a conversation that had grown from 7 minutes of silence into something that filled his evenings and softened the lines around his eyes. Ivy walked into the garage carrying a fresh box of tools she'd ordered online with money she'd earned helping Claire at the bakery. She set the box on the workbench, pulled out a socket set, and sat down next to Patch. "Show me," she said. Patch looked at her. The bruises on his face had faded to yellow. The stitches on his side were healing. He was 22 years old, and he had been tortured in a concrete room by men who wanted information he refused to give, and now he was sitting in a fire station teaching a 10-year-old girl how to build a wheel, and the look on his face, the look of a young man who had been broken and put back together and found that the new shape of himself was stronger than the old one, was the quietest kind of victory there is. Coulter leaned against the bay door and watched them, coffee in his hand, leather on his back. The spring sun on his face, the sound of tools and music and voices, his people's voices, filling the space around him like something solid, something real, something that the world had tried to take from him and failed. He thought about Emma. He always thought about Emma. But for the first time in years, the thought didn't come with the drowning feeling, the black water closing over his head, the hallway he could never reach the end of. Instead, it came with something gentler, the memory of his daughter's laugh, the way she used to sit on the garage floor and hand him wrenches while he worked, the way she once told him, at age 5, that she wanted to be a motorcycle when she grew up. Not ride one, be one. He'd laughed so hard he'd dropped a socket into the engine block and spent 20 minutes fishing it out. He smiled. Standing in the doorway of a fire station in a town that had almost died and was learning to live again, surrounded by men who had been broken by wars and divorces and addictions and loneliness, and who had found, in each other and in one small girl with bare feet and a backpack full of secrets, a reason to keep standing. Outside, Harleys rested in the spring sun while the last traces of winter melted from the mountains. Inside, Ivy sat at the workbench with grease on her fingers and a socket wrench in her hand, learning how things were built from men who knew what it meant to be rebuilt. The blues played. The coffee brewed. The light came in through the open bay doors and fell across the concrete floor in long, warm rectangles that looked, if you squinted, like roads leading somewhere good. And in the corner, on the wall, Reno's mural glowed in the morning light. 7 motorcycles on an endless highway. A small figure holding on, riding toward a horizon that never ended, because that was the point. The road doesn't end. You just find better people to ride it with.